Chapter 41. The Blow That Shatters the Shackles. After 2 more days of rest, Charles finally stepped out of the small room where he'd been holed up for 4 days. As he reached the deck, a chorus of voices rose to greet him. "Boss! Boss!" He lifted a hand in acknowledgement, a genuine smile lighting his face. Warm sunlight washed over him, and the sight of an impossibly blue sky filled him with relief. His recent draw against Zephyr hadn't been a flashy victory, but it had done the job. Charles was now officially among the top-tier players. Admittedly, he occupied the lowest rung of that elite group, but he had every confidence he'd climb higher. After all, he was only 17. 17 years old and already a father of 2, with another child on the way. The thought never failed to make him grin. While most time travelers marked their adventures by slaying celestial dragons, provoking the 4 emperors, or indulging in epic duels and occasional trysts with bewitched maids, he'd managed something far more extraordinary. He'd become a parent. Twice over. It was almost ridiculous to consider. "Master!" came a sharp call from the crew, snapping Charles back to the present. He took a steadying breath, squared his shoulders, and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For now, at least, the shackles of doubt felt broken, and nothing could stop him from moving forward. "Be careful you don't catch a chill out here," Martha called softly, pressing a thick woolen cloak into his hands. Charles paused at the bow, the wind tugging at his coat as he stared into the gray expanse of ocean. Martha's golden hair whipped around her shoulders, and the subtle curve of her belly showed she was months from term. Without a word, she offered him the warm robe. He slipped it on gratefully. "Thank you," he said, meeting her gentle smile. He couldn't help but remember their first encounter, the dim hold of the slaver's ship, where she sat like a fallen princess in chains. He'd stared at her then, utterly captivated. Her cheeks had flamed under his gaze, and he'd felt like the worst kind of fool. Disciplined once, but now undone by a single look. They say rabbits never eat the grass by their own burrow, yet here he was, nibbling away at the one thing he most wanted to protect. And the old saying about men, 1 first time and 1,000 next times, rang true in his mind. He'd already lost count. Charles cleared his throat, brushing away his awkward thoughts. "It's too windy here. Why don't we go back inside?" Martha nodded, her hair glinting in the cold light. Together, they turned from the deck's edge and made their way to the cabin, leaving the restless sea behind. "Master!" called one of the maids. Martha hummed softly as she returned with 2 attendants, one carrying a tray of tea, the other bearing the morning's freshly printed newspapers. Charles Rockefeller, however, barely registered the bustle. He stood alone at the bow of his ship, eyes fixed on the rolling horizon. He accepted a newspaper without looking away from the sea, unfolding it slowly. What was next for him? Challenge the world government? Impossible. Those were adventures for Roger or Luffy. Become pirate king? Not his style. All Charles wanted was a simple, quiet life, an almost absurd wish in a world as tumultuous as this. He glanced down at the headline, Rockefeller Charles, Bounty, 5,000 berries. A wry smile tugged at his lips. Only the Golden Lion boasted a higher reward. His own bounty now ranked 2nd on the Rocks Pirates ledger and 4th overall among every crew under their flag, surpassing notorious figures like John Silveraxe and Charlotte Lingling. The Navy headquarters certainly knew how to make a statement. Charles chuckled softly, recalling the news he'd learned just yesterday. 4 days ago, a routine skirmish, barely worth mentioning, had erupted into a full-blown crisis, bringing the Rocks Pirates to the brink of war with the Navy. Even he had been stunned when the details finally reached him. He folded the paper, tucked it under his arm, and returned his gaze to the endless blue. Simple as his dream was, in these seas it remained the greatest challenge of all. Charles breathed a long sigh of relief. Both sides had pulled back just in time. If they hadn't, he might never have known how to stop himself. Now that he'd come fully to his senses, he realized how completely he'd been ruled by emotion. Zephyr's relentless pursuit had cast a long shadow over him, and from the moment he'd escaped, Charles vowed to become stronger. For the past year, he had thrown himself into grueling training. He'd based himself on Hive Island, living like a secluded enthusiast. Every morning he'd set sail, hunting down pirates, raiding merchant ships, sparring with renowned New World fighters, or disappearing to deserted islets to perfect his boxing against the silent mountains. That constant self-imposed pressure kept him on edge, ever vigilant, ever hungry for improvement. In the end, he hadn't outright defeated Ziffa, but he had managed to draw. That hard-won stalemate was proof his year of effort had not been in vain, and it brought him a deep, unexpected comfort. Ha! At that exhalation, Charles felt something surge within him. Boom! An overwhelming shockwave of energy exploded outward, a domineering aura unlike anything he had ever unleashed before. This was the fiercest eruption in all of Charles's history, and it was only the beginning. The sea heaved and roared as towering swells tossed stunned schools of fish and even sea kings into the air. Beneath Charles's tyrant-like aura, the crew cried out, their eyes rolling back as they collapsed to the deck, foam at their lips. He kept the circumference of his power carefully in check. Any spillover into the cabin might unsettle Martha's unborn child's chi, and he wasn't about to risk that. With that restraint secured, Charles unleashed his full might. In a single, effortless motion, he soared skyward, his oppressive presence parting the clouds until a perfect sunlit dome hovered around him. He savored the rush of power until a mocking laugh shattered the moment. Ha! Who's radiating such a formidable aura? So it's you. The voice came before the figure, echoing across the waves. From the direction of Hive Island drifted Shiji, the golden lion. At the first taunt, Charles's aura snapped forward, a living thing intent on battle. Shiji only laughed again, deep, triumphant, almost amused. Ha! Don't think that trading blows with Zephyr gives you the right to challenge me, the one and only. In that instant, the golden lion materialized fully and unleashed a single, sweeping slash toward Charles. Charles felt the cut wasn't deep, but his senses screamed danger. This was no ordinary strike. It carried the weight of a master swordsman's skill. Still, he refused to yield. With a decisive motion, he drew his newly forged longsword and met the blow head-on. Clang! Standing a few paces away, the golden-maned beast Shiji, cigarette dangling from his lips, arched an eyebrow. Even through the smoke, he could sense that Charles's parry lacked something. Ha! Shiji murmured, amusement creeping into his voice. Not bad, but let me show you what a true great swordsman can do. He tugged at the hilt of the Sakura 10 dead tree strapped to his back. In an instant, the massive blade was in his grasp, and with a roar he descended in a devastating crosscut. This time, Charles felt more than just the force of the strike. He felt intention, unyielding, driven will behind it. He glimpsed in an instant the countless hours of Shiji's training, the battles fought, and the lofty dream that shaped every slash. Is this what it means to be a great swordsman? Charles wondered. Shaking off the thought, he squared his shoulders and met Shiji's gaze. You think it's will that makes a great swordsman? Shiji's grin widened, exposing sharp canines. Tell me, boy, what's your dream? To become king of the world, the greatest swordsman alive? For a moment, Charles hesitated, memories of endless drills and hard-won Katori's flashing by, his own dreams and doubts laid bare. Shiji's laughter cut through the tension. No, not at all. My dream is freedom. And with that, he lunged again, Sakura 10 dead tree cleaving air and spirit alike, determined to prove that true mastery comes not from titles, but from the unshackled heart. I want to sail freely across these seas and protect the people who matter to me. Charles's eyes blazed with conviction, and a fierce determination settled over his features. My will is mine alone. I won't let anyone stand in my way. In an instant, his aura flared like a rising storm. He lunged forward, sword whirling to intercept Shiji's cross-slash. The two blades collided with a thunderous ring, and at that decisive moment, Charles's blade sliced cleanly through Shiji's attack, forcing his opponent to step back. Chapter 42, The Great Swordsman. A roar of triumph rang out as Shiji, the golden-maned lion, stamped the ground before him. Ha ha ha! I didn't misread it, the lion exclaimed, eyes blazing. That strike of yours, you've officially broken into the great swordsman realm. Charles felt a surge of energy flood his veins. He really had done it. With this breakthrough, he would forever be known as Charles the Crimson Great Swordsman. He drew in a long, steady breath, savoring the newfound power coursing through his body. Shiji descended and settled onto his haunches just ahead of Charles, his mane shimmering like molten gold. Your talent is enviable, kid, he rumbled, amusement in his deep voice. Few have ever reached this height so quickly. Charles allowed himself a proud smile. Thank you, Shiji. Your strike opened my eyes to what I needed. Without it, I don't know when, or if, I would have broken through. The lion's golden eyes softened. Consider it a gift, then, he said. But know this, I will ask one favor of you in the future. It will be within your power to grant it, and I will not force you if you truly refuse. Beside Charles, Skeet stood silently, gazing out at the calm sea. The waves lapped gently against the shore, and a faint breeze carried the tang of salt. Charles frowned at Shiji's words. He hated feeling indebted to anyone, yet this was a debt he willingly accepted, and one he suspected he would repay without hesitation. Charles moved with unbridled energy, and Shiki couldn't help but admire how he'd already surpassed the famed swordsman. When Charles frowned in confusion, Shiki offered no further explanation. Remember this, boy. From now on, when I call on you, you need only lend me your strength once. With that, Shiki rose again into the sky and flew off toward Hive Island, though his voice echoed on a moment longer. Charles watched him go, sinking into deep thought. What did Shiki intend for him to do? Based on Charles's later deeds, wouldn't Shiki want him to help seize control of the world, perhaps even crown Shiki king of all? But that seemed impossible. Rox was still alive, and even if someone wanted to become the world's ruler, the timing simply wasn't right. Could it mean Shiki planned to betray Rox? It was Charles's only lead. Of course, he didn't know that. 2 years from now, Rox would fall to Roger and Garp in the Valley of the Gods. The more he thought about it, the surer he grew, especially considering Shiki's recent behavior. His growing discontent with Rox was no secret. Even Whitebeard rarely returned to the island now. Day after day, he drifted out at sea in his little boat, ignoring Rox's summons. When or if he'd ever come back was anyone's guess. It's time for the Rox pirates to vanish. Charles felt that familiar knot of urgency tighten in his chest. It had been less than 2 years since the Battle of the Valley of the Gods, yet the fallout was already threatening to engulf the seas in chaos. With Rox dead, the power vacuum left behind would spark a ruthless scramble for control. Only the sudden rise of the 3 legendary pirates had brought a fragile calm, but Charles knew that peace wouldn't last long. The surrender of the pirate king Roger had thrown everything into disarray again, this time directed squarely at the Navy. Their 3 future admirals were still untested and far from full strength. Without seasoned leaders at sea, the Navy was vulnerable. That weakness had driven the remaining Rox pirates out of the New World, forcing them into hiding and scattering their fleet across distant waters. Yet between the fall of Rox and the emergence of Roger, Whitebeard, and Big Mom, the world had hovered on the brink of anarchy. Worse still, the Navy was on the brink of a sweeping leadership reshuffle. Cyborg Kong was set to become Admiral of the Fleet, and Zephyr would be promoted to one of the warlord generals in the warring states. Only Vice Admiral Kapu refused to climb higher, electing to remain in his current post. Charles realized that once those oceans took effect, the balance of power at sea would shift yet again. And if the Rox pirates didn't strike now, before the Navy's new hierarchy took root, they might never get another chance. It would be absurd to consider Monkey D. Garp just a vice admiral. Someday, he'll be remembered as the naval hero who chased down the One Piece itself. Though he hasn't earned that title yet, it doesn't make him any less formidable. Charles, now a member of the Rox pirates, hadn't had the chance to face Garp in battle, but he'd listened closely to the tales from Whitebeard and the Golden Lion Shiki. Neither of those titanic fighters had come away with any advantage when they tangled with Garp. Both ended up bruised, battered, and humbled. Clearly, Garp exacts a heavy toll on anyone who dares oppose him. Sizing up their strength, Charles knew better than to imagine he could best Whitebeard, Edward Newgate, or Shiki. And if he ever ran into Garp leading a naval pursuit, he'd be hopelessly outmatched. The thought of that particular future sent a jolt of urgency through him. Right now, he was only just keeping pace with Zephyr. He needed more power. Fast. With a growl of frustration, Charles slammed his sword down into the churning sea. The waters roared in protest, splitting apart beneath his strike as if cleaved by steel. Yet as he stared at his blade, he felt the sting of disappointment. This was the height of his ability today, and it wasn't nearly enough. Charles wanted a high-quality sword, but in the pirate world, the best blades were almost always katanas or European-style swords, and he wasn't used to either. All he had in his treasury was a Western blade called Holy Land's Judgment, ranked 21st among greatswords. It was absurdly sharp, outrageously ornate, and brutally expensive. Whenever Charles coated the blade in armament Haki and let his intimidating aura wash over a would-be attacker, their weapons shattered against his. Still, he dreamed of forging his own jet-black sword, one that would naturally cloak itself in Haki without the need for any extra coating. The problem was, he didn't know how long such a process would take. He'd even tried it, focusing his Haki around an unremarkable blade until it blackened. But in the heat of battle, the result was disastrous. His self-made Haki sword snapped in two under an opponent's strike, even though he'd wrapped it in his armament Haki. The root of his frustration was clear. His Haki wasn't strong enough. In his duel with Zephyr, Charles had learned firsthand that no matter how skillfully you apply armament Haki, if your inner strength doesn't match your opponent's, you'll be outmatched. And your blade, no matter how well crafted or Haki infused, will crumble. Charles had decided his next project would be to master his armament, his armed domineering, and the best way to sharpen that skill was by sparring with someone who already wielded it. No matter how hard he trained alone, without a true opponent, the progress would be minimal. Of course, it all depended on circumstances, and Charles still hadn't found a suitable partner or even a sparring bag to practice on. First things first, he needed a proper weapon. He recalled that during Luffy's voyage, he'd once encountered a remarkable blade, a devil sword known as the Seven-Star Sword. Rumor had it the sword lay hidden somewhere in the first half of the Grand Line, on an island called Asuka. As soon as he could spare the time, he'd set out to find it. But he didn't know exactly where Asuka Island was. He would need help, and only one person sprang to mind: Xiachi. As navigator of the Lock crew and an underworld intelligence agent, Xiachi would almost certainly know Asuka's coordinates. If Charles wanted that seven-star sword and a worthy sparring partner, his next stop had to be her. Shaggy? Charles shot upright at the sound of his name. He knew that voice all too well. In the years to come, Raleigh's former lover would tail Charles day and night, open a shady tavern on the edge of port, and even moonlight as an information broker. Yet despite their history, she remained endlessly curious about the enigmatic captain of 8th Team, known simply as Rocks. From the moment she stepped aboard the ship, she had been quietly piecing together every fact she could find on Charles. But the deeper she delved, the stranger he seemed to become. He had been perfectly ordinary until his 10th birthday. Then something in him shifted, and he'd never been the same since. Chapter 43. The Location of Asuka Island. Charles had persuaded Captain Xiachi to sail with him to Kamai Island, his childhood home, hoping to dig up any clue about the legendary Asuka Island. They combed every port tavern, quizzed every fisherman and merchant who'd visited the Grand Line, but came up empty-handed. Back on deck, Charles turned to Xiachi. "Asuka Island," he said, voice low but insistent. "Do you know where it is?" The captain frowned, stroking his beard. "All I've heard is that it lies somewhere in the first half of the Grand Line. Beyond that, its precise location remains a mystery. Even the world government has no records that hold." Charles nodded crisply. "Thanks for the lead." He clasped Xiachi's forearm in a brief handshake, then slipped away before the captain could ask another question. Xiachi watched the boy go, muttering under his breath, "Strange kid, but I can't help worrying about him." In the days that followed, Charles's only detours were a quick stop at Beehive Island and a secret meeting with the other members of the Rock's pirates. Otherwise, he secluded himself on his own ship. He skipped the usual morning playtime with his daughter, barely glanced at his son, and even set aside the intense training regimen he'd once embraced. What occupied his thoughts instead was the memory of his duel with Zephyr, the flash of triumph in her eyes when she consumed a devil fruit. He couldn't get over how incredibly lucky she'd been. Every sunrise found Charles more determined than before to uncover Asuka Island's hidden location and to carve out a destiny of his own making. Charles's combat aura wasn't especially overpowering, but his knowledge aura alone was enough to crush Zephyr. In battle, he could read his opponent's thoughts as easily as leafing through a book and foresee danger long before it struck. On top of that, Charles constantly radiated a subtle, domineering aura that scrambled Zifa's own mental and mystic senses, leaving him unable to anticipate Charles's next move. All Zifa could do was match Charles blow for blow with sheer physical strength and willful arrogance. That was why Charles could stand his ground. Enough theory. This is getting a bit long-winded. As Charles ran through a series of arm-strengthening drills on the prow of his skiff, he caught the faint static of a phone bug hidden beneath the rail. He paused and flipped it open. "Xiachi?" he asked. A familiar, slightly raspy voice crackled back. "Hey, big brother, still remember me? Shaggy?" Charles smiled at the nickname Xiachi loved to use. Laughing, she said, "Of course I remember. Have you located Asuka Island yet?" "Got it," Charles replied with a grin. "I've pinpointed its coordinates. Send your team over, and I'll fill you in." "Perfect," Xiachi said. Then, without another word, she hung up. Charles closed the bug and returned it to his coat pocket, barely giving her casual tone a second thought. He'd found Asuka Island, and that was all that mattered. Chapter Text: Quest for the Twin Blade. Behold, the 7-star sword. Having secured the navigational chart from Shakina, Charles strode into Commander Rox Gbek's private audience chamber. The massive Sea Lord looked up in astonishment. "What did you say? You actually intend to embark on the first leg of the grand voyage? Are you out of your mind?" Charles met his glare steadily. "I'm quite serious. There's a legendary twin blade hidden in that sector. Its counterpart to the 7-star sword. I must recover it." Silence fell. For long seconds, Rox Gbek simply stared. Then he exhaled heavily. "Very well, but mark my words, return in one piece." Charles inclined his head and turned to leave. Behind him, the chamber erupted with the commander's roaring laughter. A fierce, domineering aura filled the hall, so overwhelming that the maids trembled and some even fainted. Unaware of the spectacle he'd left in his wake, Charles made his way back to the docks. Once aboard his ship, he gave crisp orders: prepare the 50-meter launch and set sail at first light. The crew, well acquainted with their captain's reputation and too awed to argue, fell quickly into line. With chart in hand and unwavering resolve, Charles readied himself for the perilous journey ahead. 2 years have passed since Charles first sailed from Kame Island with his original band of sailors and fighters, brave men who battled across every sea and ultimately paid the price with their lives. Undaunted, Charles replenished his crew each year at the island's rock recruitment contest, selecting those whose resolve shone brightest and whose hearts harbored no ill will. Yet the majority of his newest crew weren't hopeful contestants, but desperate souls he'd freed from slave ships, drifters and outcasts, much like the maids he once rescued. Before welcoming them aboard, Charles interrogated each one carefully, ensuring no hidden traitors lurked among them. Rescue, however, was only the beginning. The savage conflicts of the New World had taught Charles that without strength, no vessel, no matter how swift or clever, could endure these waters. So he poured his knowledge and resources into his crew's training. Any man willing to master the 6 naval arts or the Dominion techniques, whether the cunning of strategy or the rigor of combat, received Charles's full instruction. Nothing was held back, no secret withheld. Looking at their skill and loyalty in the years since, Charles felt a quiet pride, especially for those few who had remained with him from the day they all left Kame Island. After 2 years at sea, Charles's crew had truly been reborn, each member stronger than ever before. Of all his followers, 7 stood out as the most powerful, and Charles appointed each of them as petty captains, entrusting them with their own squads. Rodney Carter was the first among these. He'd been Charles's right hand since the very beginning. Originally a slave on Kame Island, Rodney had been rescued by Charles on their maiden voyage, and ever since his loyalty had never wavered. Today, he was the only one whose strength even rivaled Charles's own. Rodney had mastered 4 of the Navy's 6 martial techniques: steel slash, iron block, moonstep, and mistfoot, and on top of that, he'd awakened both armament haki and observation haki. As a further reward, Charles had given him a rare animal-type devil fruit, the horse fruit, model Zebra. With its power, Rodney's combat ability now equaled that of a Navy rear admiral. Bernier Ralph's story was similar. A pirate by trade, he'd fought alongside his former captain until that man fell in battle. Captured and sold into slavery, Ralph seemed destined for a grim fate, until Charles's crew intercepted the slaver's ship. Grateful for his freedom, Ralph willingly swore his sword to Charles, determined to repay the kindness that had saved his life. Together, Charles at the helm, Rodney at his side, and Bernier among the new petty captains, the crew pressed onward. 2 years of hardship and relentless training had forged them into a force to be reckoned with. Now, with their destinies intertwined, they prepared to carve their names into the world's history. At first, Charles refused his request to join the crew. Day after day, the young man knelt on the deck, head bowed so low that he slammed his forehead against the planks in his desperation. Finally, Charles, impressed by such unyielding persistence, relented and welcomed him aboard. That recruit was Bernier Ralph, a fiercely competitive youth. Under Charles's guidance, Ralph trained tirelessly, revealing a natural talent for physical combat. In less than a year, he mastered the Navy's 6-style technique and even learned its 3-style offshoot. Charles has promised that, should the chance arise, he will obtain an animal-type devil fruit to further amplify Ralph's prodigious strength. Another valued crewmate is Monica Harrington. Physically, she is not remarkably strong, but she wields a rare devil fruit power that grants her flight. 2 years ago, Monica had been enslaved, doomed to serve the celestial dragons simply because of her ability. Charles rescued her, and she chose to remain by his side as a member of his pirate ship. In truth, every person who sails with Charles joined of their own free will. He never forces anyone to stay, but the instant they sign on, betrayal is out of the question. Blessed with the ability to read minds, Charles made certain that no one harbored secret motives or hidden grudges. Each of them, he discovered, had come aboard with nothing but hopes for a better future. Monica Harrington ate the Zoan-type dragonfly devil fruit, granting her the ability to transform into a dragonfly, an exceptionally agile flyer who often comes to Charles's aid. She now serves as the captain of Charles's maids. Chapter 44. Charles's Maid Fleet. Charles's ship now carried over 60 maids, almost as many as his sailors. John couldn't resist teasing him. At this rate, she'll be a floating kingdom of daughters. And truly, each girl was more radiant than the last, far outshining the rouged beauties back on the islands. The rumor of Charles's harem drew attention from every corner of the fleet. One night, Haitan Muon, the younger brother of the 7th Division's captain, snuck aboard, surely hoping to get close to those famed beauties. His arrogance quickly met its match when Charles caught him in the act. Without hesitation, Charles struck. Haitan's barrier fruit powers went up in smoke the instant Charles focused his internal Haki on the point of impact, shattering his defenses. Within seconds, the nobleman was crumpled on the deck, bones bruised and ribs fractured. Only the swift intervention of Locke, Charles's steadfast first mate, prevented a fatal blow. Had Locke arrived a moment later, Haitan would have ended up in 2 pieces. Even that near tragedy couldn't dampen Charles's pride in his maids. Purchased cheaply at various slave markets, they required little beyond food and shelter, yet their presence transformed the ship into a place of color and laughter. Each morning, their voices drifted along the decks as they went about their chores. To Charles, they were more than servants. They were living trophies, proof that he could command both respect and beauty on the high seas. And that, he thought with a grin, was worth every coin he spent. Nick Hume had been the ship's doctor aboard Charles's vessel ever since the young captain first set sail. Even after all these years at sea, his medical expertise remained unmatched. No common illness on board was beyond his cure. Fewer people knew that Nick was also an excellent sniper. His aim stayed true even on a rolling deck. But at over 50 years old, he no longer had the strength for long voyages. Recently, Charles had appointed Nick to train the 5 young maids in both medicine and marksmanship. Nick welcomed the change. Once one of the maids proved fully competent, he planned to leave the ship and return to Kame Island, where he would spend his remaining years caring for the elderly. To make sure Nick could retire in comfort, Charles promised him a generous bonus of several million Baileys as soon as the apprentices were ready. In the pirate world, such a pledge was rare and priceless to a man longing for a peaceful old age. Touched by the captain's goodwill, Nick threw himself into teaching. Under his guidance, the maids mastered wound treatment, herbal remedies, and even the steady trigger control he had honed as a sniper. Charles watched their progress with deep satisfaction. With Nick's steady hand shaping the next generation of healers and sharpshooters, the ship was safer and its future more secure than ever. Adolf Rudolph towers over everyone on board, nearly 4 meters tall and built like a fortress. He claims his giant ancestry as the source of both his strength and his uncanny hammering techniques, which he developed through years of trial and error. But don't let his size fool you. Adolf is a notorious drinker, perpetually steaming from one mug of ale to the next. His dual role as shipwright and helmsman earned him a place on Charles's crew, and he never hesitates to remind the captain that he keeps both rudder and hull in fighting shape. Provided, of course, there's wine in it for him. Charles first encountered Adolf at a royal shipyard during a daring raid on the kingdom's northern island. Struck by the giant's raw talent, Charles broke with his usual practice of waiting for willing volunteers and offered Adolf a single, generous barrel of fine wine in exchange for his services. The arrangement has proven simple and effective. Whenever the ship takes damage, whether from a storm's fury or a naval skirmish, Adolf Rudolph swings back into action, rebuilding and reinforcing every beam and board. In return, Charles sees to it that the giant's cup never runs dry. The rest of the deckhands joined under very different circumstances. 2 of them were recruited at the famed Rocks Recruiting Conference, a boisterous gathering where hundreds of hopefuls compete for a spot on any ship daring enough to sail the high seas. Unlike the more exclusive methods favored by the infamous Golden Lion Shiji or the cunning privateer John, who each draw only a handful of hand-picked recruits, the Rocks Conference is a free-for-all. It supplies Charles's crew with the eager and untested, while Adolf Rudolph remains the indispensable expert whose loyalty is guaranteed by each rich amber reward. Charles had never intended to join the fray, he only wanted to watch. Yet by the end, the 2 youths beside him found themselves cheering him on, just as avidly as any fan from his past life. The moment they learned that Charles was a swordsman, they begged to serve under his banner. Why Charles? They had their reasons. Golden Lion Shiji wielded a devil fruit ability, so he couldn't claim the pure swordman's title. Silver Axe, though a formidable fighter, used an axe rather than a blade. And Captain Wang Ji? He was simply too old, no match for Charles's youth, and lacking Charles's dazzling promise. Of all the commanders present, only Charles fit their ideal. A true swordsman, untainted by devil fruit powers, still in his teens, yet already showing the raw talent that promised he'd one day be the world's greatest. He wasn't yet a great swordsman, but with his natural aptitude, it felt inevitable. With that conviction, the 2 teenagers eagerly pledged themselves to Charles's command. Their unexpected enthusiasm turned heads, and suddenly Xiaoluo found herself both surprised and amused. Charles had become a rising star in the swordsman community, all because of this single incident. Charles's reputation had spread far and wide, and it wasn't long before he attracted a pair of eager disciples, Paul Bunyan, who fought with a nimble one-handed sword, and Isaac Marlowe, whose weapon of choice was a massive 2-hander. To both of them, facing ordinary foot soldiers was no more challenging than slicing through vegetables. Only the toughest opponents posed any real test. Charles himself was no slouch. He had spent years training at the renowned Sword Hall, mastering every technique they taught and building an unshakable foundation. That solid pedigree was precisely why he'd agreed to take Paul and Isaac under his wing. Now, wherever they went, the 2 young swordsmen peppered him with questions, stance adjustments, blade angles, feints, footwork. Every answer from Charles felt like a treasure, and their excitement only grew with each lesson. Soon word of their apprenticeship reached the current students at the Sword Hall, who listened with a mix of awe and envy. After all, who wouldn't want the blood swordmaster of the Rocks pirates at their side? Once they realized that Charles, famed across the seas for his crimson-stained blade, had chosen Paul and Isaac as his protégés, even the most confident hall students couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. And Charles? He merely smiled, already planning his next demonstration. Only a handful of truly renowned swordsmen still sailed the seas, Only a select few even qualified as great swordsmen. Yet it was nearly impossible to join their ranks. Take the Roger pirates, for example. Earning a place under Gol D Roger and training with Dark King Rayleigh was virtually out of reach. The crew wandered without a fixed course, slipping like ghosts from one corner of the ocean to the next. Ambitious bladesmen, desperate for guidance, found themselves stranded, with no master to seek out. The rival Rocks pirates had considered recruiting top swordsmen after Wen Daoxi fell in battle, but they refused to let his sacrifice go to waste. Sadly, the only officers they could offer were brutal by nature. Aside from Charles, there were only two other swordsmen of any note. Shiji, nicknamed the Golden Lion for his fierce, uncaring tactics toward friend or foe alike, and the so-called Axe King, S. of John Silver, a band more interested in loot than honorable duels. Any reasonable swordsman would balk at signing up for such a life of bloodshed. Then Charles made his move. With Paul and Isaac spreading word of his skill and valor, swordsmen from every shore took to the waves in droves, begging to serve under his banner. They came mad with ambition, each hoping that, through Charles's tutelage, they might finally shatter their limits and claim the title of great swordsman for themselves. He unleashed a soaring slash, but unfortunately, Charles hadn't grasped just how much the swordsmen respected his authority. Over the past year, he'd been consumed by one battle after another, or buried in relentless training, and he'd paid little mind to the loyalties of his crew. Those 7 men were the strongest fighters under his command. Each possessed a unique talent, and together they kept the ship running smoothly, and most importantly, they stood guard whenever Charles was away. After all, the seas are full of hotheads looking for glory. They provoke the captain, hoping that a victory over him will make their names famous. Charles couldn't personally deal with every challenge. Even if it all came down to a single sword stroke, pride was on the line, and that was something he refused to leave to chance. Chapter 45, Departing Aska Island. Captain, all ships are ready. Paul and Isaac hurried forward, their voices bright with deference. Excellent. Charles offered a curt nod as he stepped aboard the lead vessel. The 2 officers barely remarked. Such confidence was expected of a swordsman. What they did not know was that their captain had long since attained the rank of great swordsman. Had they realized it, their faces would have lit up with surprise and pride. Few accomplishments rivaled breaking through to that exalted level. This ship itself was extraordinary, a relic of the old wind-shear fleets. Its sleek hull and billowing sails caught the wind like no ordinary warship. Even a general's flagship would struggle to keep pace. But Charles did not linger to admire its craftsmanship. His destination lay to the southeast, on distant Aska Island, where the legendary 7-star sword awaited. Time was of the essence. With a 2-month voyage ahead, he calculated they would return before the year 1483 drew to a close. He turned to Paul and Isaac, voice crisp. Raise the sails. We set out at once. As the crew sprang into motion, Charles felt anticipation stir in his chest. The swordsman's path was fraught with peril and promise, and he would not be denied. Looking over the deckhands, Charles counted just over 20 sailors, more than enough to crew this 50-meter vessel. In the field, however, his 8th company numbered well over 100 cutthroats, in addition to his 7 trusted lieutenants. Roughly a dozen of those pirates were the last survivors of the Wolf Gang, the same ones who'd trailed him on Kamei Island. To keep such a rabble in line, Charles had appointed his most capable men as 10-man squad leaders, and then passed responsibility for them to Carter. Carter, naturally, never had the time to micromanage. So the rank and file spent most days either slogging through Carter's occasional drills or cashing their paychecks to blow their earnings on Hive Island's taverns each month. Charles didn't much mind. As long as they turned up for missions, they served their purpose. He scheduled every operation around their availability and treated them like the expendable assets they were. Pirates, not pampered pets, and refused to fuss over anyone's comfort or morale. Charles stood on the quarterdeck, arms folded, watching his inexperienced crew mill about the port. If he let them handle a real fight, they'd flail wildly with knives or fire off shots over each other's heads, hardly the stuff of pirates. All he'd end up doing was sweeping up the aftermath, gathering whatever loot they happened to stumble upon. He had no illusions about their combat prowess. "Captain, we're ready," called Isaac from below, his voice carrying over the creaking timbers. Paul stood at his side, hauling taut the ship's sail ropes. Charles drew a steady breath. "Very well, let the first leg of our grand voyage begin." His voice rang clear, tinged with the faintest hint of excitement. Isaac and Paul nodded in unison. "All hands cast off," they roared, and the crew leapt into action. The ropes rattled, and bits of dockside chatter faded as the gangplank was hauled in. Under Charles's steady gaze, the schooner eased out of its berth and into the channel. Hive Island's busy shoreline receded at a glacial pace, the familiar sprawl of warehouses and fishermen's stalls blurring into the distance. Soon, the vessel was a dark silhouette against the bright harbor, then barely a speck on the horizon. Word of the 8th Division's departure spread through the island like wildfire. Merchants and dockhands exchanged hushed theories. Some suspected spies of the world government, others whispered of informants from Navy headquarters. Back at HQ, an agent's desk phone crackled to life. "Moses, come in. This is headquarters." A tense voice cut through layers of static and curiosity. As murmured reports streamed in from every corner of Hive Island, Charles's expedition had already set sail, oblivious to the storm of interest gathering behind them, and perhaps the trials still to come. The alarm bells at Hive Island's naval station had barely stopped ringing before Admiral Crane's communicator crackled to life. "This is CP0. Charles, captain of the 8th Division of the Rocks Pirates on Hive Island in the New World, has set sail. His destination remains unknown. Alert Navy headquarters immediately." The line went dead. Crane turned sharply to his 2 senior officers, Cyborg Sora and General Zephyr. "What? Charles is already off the island." Zephyr sprang to his feet, eyes blazing. Lieutenant Kong, one of their cyborg enforcers, jumped up beside him. "General Zephyr, may I give chase at once? We can intercept the pirate and detain him in Forward City." Zephyr fixed Kong with a cold stare. "Everyone, sit down." Kong paused, confusion written across his face. "Sit down," Zephyr barked, brooking no argument. Before Kong could protest again, Sora raised her voice. "General, we all agree that Charles must be stopped, but we can't rush in blindly. He has the full weight of the Rocks Pirates behind him. Any hasty action will spark a major conflict. We need to coordinate with Naval Command and think through the wider consequences." At Sora's words, Zephyr's jaw clenched. Then he slowly settled back into his chair. The tension in the room eased as Sora's tone softened. "All right," she said. "Let's gather our intelligence and plan a strategic response." Cyborg Kong, one of the 3 he trusted most, still showed remarkable calm. "Zephyr, we don't even know what our opponent's goal is," he said, folding his arms. "We can't just launch a blind attack. What if it's a trap?" Standing beside him, Crane offered a reassuring nod. Zephyr felt the knot in her chest loosen. "You're right, General," she agreed. Before the mood grew too tense, Cyborg Sora let out a hearty laugh. "Speaking of celebrations, I heard someone's getting married. We need to have a proper wedding toast." Zephyr's lips curved into a genuine smile. "That's true," she admitted. "When the big day comes, you 2 must invite Admiral Garp and Sengoku. I insist on a grand party." Crane chuckled and leaned back. But at the mention of Garp, Kong's playful scowl reappeared. "That old sea dog," he grumbled. "Every year at this time he takes leave just to visit his son. I wonder if anyone at Naval Headquarters even notices he's gone." His tone was teasing rather than harsh, and the others laughed. Zephyr shook her head with amusement. "You know, Garp, he can't stop talking about training his boy for the Navy. Mark my words, in a few years, that kid will be enrolled at Naval HQ's academy." Laughter filled the room as the friends shared a lighter moment, the tension of the mission momentarily forgotten. Charles had thought his old rival merely wanted to send his own son to train under him, and never guessed what Vice Admiral Garp really had in mind. Slapping the table with a hearty laugh, Garp exclaimed, "Don't worry, your boy will be the Navy's greatest warrior yet." Before Charles could reply, the conversation had already shifted away from him, and now it was all about Garp's son, Dorag, and they were still in the East China Sea. "Look who's back! Dorag, your father's here!" Garp boomed, striding onto the ship's deck, a basket of fruit in hand and his uniform gleaming like fresh paint. "Daddy!" the little boy squealed, darting forward. But the instant Dorag saw Garp, his tiny face went ghost white. his smile frozen in place. Garp, oblivious, scooped him up, beaming with pride. On a completely different ship, Charles stood at the bow, the wind tearing at his coat. All around him, sailors fought the storm, furling sails, shouting orders above the roar of thunder. He hadn't sailed more than a day before the sea turned against them. Black clouds churned overhead, and he stared in disbelief as a wave nearly 20 meters tall reared up, looming over the deck like a living wall. The crew froze, clutching anything they could, rails, ropes, even barrels, eyes wide with terror. Charles gripped the rail beside him, knuckles Y.T. He'd trained for danger, but nothing had prepared him for nature's fury unleashed in this unforgiving stretch of ocean. Damn it! Charles's heart pounded as he stared down the towering wall of water hurtling straight at the ship. If he didn't act right now, the entire deck would be smashed to bits. Instinctively, he drew the long sword from his belt, its blade gleaming in the dim light of the stormy sky. A massive swell lifted the prow of the vessel, threatening to tip it over. Every sailor on deck braced themselves, but Charles knew there was no time for shouting orders. The wave was too fast, too furious. He planted his feet firmly and fixed his gaze on that roaring tide. With a fierce exhalation, he swung his sword in a sweeping arc, nearly 30 meters of blades slashing through the air, aimed squarely at the wave's crest. For an instant, Charles imagined splitting the water clean in two. The wind whipped at his hair, and for a moment, hope flared in his chest. Then the wave answered back. The immense wall of water surged forward, enveloping his blade and twisting the slash aside. Cold spray hit him like 1,000 needles as the wave's fury redirected his strike, sending him staggering off balance. The deck lurched beneath his feet, and he barely managed to stay upright. Soaked and windblown, Charles steadied himself, eyes blazing with determination. He tightened his grip on the sword. The sea might have deflected his first blow, but he wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Chapter 46. Charles had clearly underestimated the power of those towering waves, but he refused to give up, because to surrender here would mean certain destruction for the ship. Charles wasn't about to die so easily. He would hold on as long as he could. He raised his blade and struck again. Whoosh! Whoosh! 2 more massive, 50-meter-long slashes cut through the storm-churned sea. His sword glowed with a domineering, almost tyrannical aura as he poured every ounce of his strength into those arcs. To everyone's amazement, the water cleaved briefly along his path. But before more than a trickle could pass, the wave's surface reknit itself, erasing the breach within seconds. A flicker of hope ignited in Charles's chest. "Quick, everyone, steer the ship straight through that gap I just opened," he shouted, turning to face the crew. Below deck, the pirates had watched his first strike vanish harmlessly and felt despair settle over them. But when they saw Charles's second and third mighty sweeps slice the wave, hope blazed in their eyes once more. "Brothers, head for the opening the captain made," Paul bellowed. Isaac seized the rudder, yanking it as hard as he could. All hands strained at the lines and sails, guiding the vessel toward the fragile rift in the colossal wave. If they could just slip through in time. Charles planted himself at the ship's bow, arms ablur as he unleashed slash after slash against the roiling sea. Each strike carved a glowing white arc, 10, 15 meters long, through the towering crest. Water exploded outward in a hiss, and for a heartbeat, a yawning gap appeared in the wave. But the ocean was relentless. Within seconds, the fissure sealed itself, forcing Charles to drive his blade again and again. "Faster," he urged, voice nearly lost to wind and spray. He could feel his strength draining with every swing. Each slash was imbued with a potent, almost tyrannical force, powerful enough to rend the waves, but punishing to wield. Behind him at the wheel, Isaac leaned forward, squinting through driving rain and salt spray. Without hesitation, he turned the rudder and surged toward the narrow breach Charles had carved. On deck, the rest of the crew braced themselves. Ahead, the seawall loomed so high it swallowed sky and sun. Even Charles's heart thudded at the sight. Yet he did not falter. His sword danced in an unceasing blur, each stroke holding the watery wall at bay. "Now!" he shouted. Isaac gave the wheel one final, decisive twist. The ship lunged into the freshly cut corridor. As Charles landed the last of his slashes, the wave behind them recoiled and closed with thunderous might. But in that fleeting moment, every soul aboard slipped through the gap to safety, unharmed and grateful to Charles's relentless defense. The instant they touched down, a wave of surprise and relief washed over the group. "Whoa, you nearly gave me a heart attack. I thought we were done for. I haven't even reached the swordsman realm yet," Paul cried, clutching Isaac's arm and trembling with relief. That fall had been far too dangerous. Charles drew in a shaky breath, only to watch his long sword slip from his fingers and clatter against the wooden deck. Without the reinforcing support of his martial aura, the blade shattered into 100 pieces. He sank to one knee, staring at the broken hilt with a bitter sigh. How many times had this happened now? Any ordinary domineering sword, lacking its wielder's aura, would crack after only a few powerful slashes. Back when he'd been in the swordsman realm, his blade had held together for days, but now, as a grand swordsman, it couldn't withstand more than a handful of swings. No wonder so many grand swordsmen prized legendary swords or heavy broadswords. Simple blades and daggers simply couldn't contain the immense energy coursing through a true master. Thinking of that, Charles's resolve to acquire the fabled 7-star sword burned even fiercer. Charles stood at the helm, squinting against the driving wind and towering waves. Even though they'd fallen back from he storm's heart, the sea still heaved around them, each swell threatening to swallow the ship whole. "Lower the sails," he shouted, voice barely carrying above the roar. The crew leapt into action, reefing canvas and securing lines before the next monstrous breaker slammed across the deck. He'd never seen a tempest this vast. From horizon to horizon, roiling dark clouds swallowed the sky, and lightning forked through their depths with unrelenting fury. Every flash struck the sea like a hammer, sending brilliant arcs of electricity into the water. When the current faded, entire shoals of fish floated belly up on the surface, their lifeless bodies bobbing in the storm-tossed waves. For a boy fresh to the Grand Line, the sight was both terrifying and exhilarating. Electric eels and small snaps crawled onto the deck in spasms, bright veins still crackling against their silvery scales. Yet admiration gave way to dread as the gale howled louder, threatening to rip the ship apart. Suddenly, a vivid image exploded in Charles's mind. Dark eyes, a crescent scar, a challenge whispered on the wind. He staggered backward, heart pounding. With a cry, he yanked his newly crafted longsword from its sheath and slashed upward at the menacing clouds. The blade cut through air and rain, scattering droplets in a fine mist. On deck, every sailor froze, then drew cutlass or pistol, pointing trembling weapons skyward. "Enemies overhead," someone yelled. But there was nothing up there, only the rolling blackness of storm clouds and the occasional jagged glow of distant lightning. Charles gripped his sword, breath ragged. Had he imagined that vision, or was the storm itself reaching for him? Everyone froze in bewilderment as a massive bolt of lightning split the sky, hurtling straight toward their boat. In that instant, Charles lunged forward and swung his blade. The lightning, seething with raw energy, met the edge of his sword and shattered in a blinding flash. Before anyone could fully grasp what had happened, Charles's blade continued upward, cutting a clean hole through the roiling clouds. Sunlight poured down onto the deck, warm and golden. Stunned faces turned skyward, the realization dawning that it was still daytime, masked all this while by those oppressive, storm-darkened clouds. But the window in the heavens lasted barely 2 minutes before the wind closed it up, and Charles's slash wavered, the crackling energy dissipating as his strength gave out. "Damn it!" Charles muttered under his breath, glaring skyward with a mix of frustration and relief. He could almost swear the heavens had targeted him personally. Though thunder still boomed and stray bolts hissed through the air, none struck close to the ship. Beyond the howling wind and rolling thunder, the worst of the storm's fury had finally eased. Just as everyone exhaled in relief, a few raindrops began splattering the deck. Rain alone wouldn't be a problem, but with it came hail. Charles kept his observation Haki on full alert. Although the thunderstorm was confined to a small area, he refused to take any chances. In an instant, a vision of the deck pelted by jagged hailstones flashed through his mind. Alarmed, he roared, "Below deck! Now! We've got hail incoming!" Whether convinced or not, the crew dashed for the companionway and crammed into the cabin. Charles followed, just as the first hailstones began to strike. Outside, the deck reverberated with deafening pings and the splintering of wood. Charles's face darkened. This new world's weather was merciless, far more dangerous than anything Luffy had faced on his first voyage through these waters. Without his own formidable strength, he knew he could have been killed outright. He braced himself against a bulkhead, then called to the nearest sailor. "How far to the nearest island?" The young seaman didn't hesitate. "About 8 nautical miles north, sir. Goma Island." "The captain is still a full day's sail from the nearest island," the navigator said, his face dark with worry. "There's no way we'll make it." "Damn," Charles muttered, his jaw clenched so tight I almost thought it would snap. I'd lost count of how many times he'd cursed since we'd realized how badly we'd misjudged our course. Chapter 47. Chelan Island. Rain and hail pounded the deck as Charles and his companions huddled inside the cabin, watching the storm batter the ship's timbers. They'd long since lost track of time, hours, perhaps days, and still the tempest raged on. But Charles remained hopeful. In this strange new world, the weather could shift in an instant, turning from hellish gale to gentle breeze without warning. He'd faced storms before, but never one as relentless as this. If their vessel hadn't been built like a fortress, it would have been torn apart. Then, at last, a slender shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds on the far horizon, bathing the deck in a warm, golden glow. Relief surged through Charles as the sun's rays touched his face. He didn't know how many days the storm had held them captive. 7? 8? But this clear patch in the sky was all the proof he needed. The worst was behind them. Before them now lay a tranquil sea, the promise of calm waters drifting in on a soft breeze. "Set course for Fishman Island," Charles cried. His crew sprang into action, ready to leave the storm behind and chase the promise of clear skies. Yes! Over 20 crewmen sprang into action, hauling ropes and trimming sails. As Charles watched their busy movements, he silently prayed that no further mishaps would occur. Fishman Island was the only way into the first half of the Grand Line. The Red Earth continent splits the world in two and divides the Grand Line into its first and second halves. For Charles, only 2 routes lay before him. One was the world government's secret underwater channel, a path reserved for those willing to surrender, something a pirate could never accept. The other was to coat his ship against the crushing pressure, dive below the waves, and approach via Fishman Island. Defying the world government was his very nature, so the latter remained his sole option. Yet it was fraught with peril. Each year, a devastating percentage of vessels passing these waters are attacked by sea kings and dragged to the depths. No surprise, since Fishman Island lies thousands of meters beneath the ocean's surface. Chapter 7. Chelan Island. The strait ahead was notorious. Every ship that dared enter had been smashed against the hidden shoals, none of its crew ever seen again. Yet this was the only passage that would lead to the first stage of the grand voyage. Captain Charles stood at the bow, eyes fixed on the roiling water, knowing there was no other choice. 4 days into their journey, he ordered the longboat lowered. It would run ashore to replenish food and fresh water. As Charles stepped onto the weathered pier, his boyish face betrayed him. Every islander recognized the infamous pirate captain. The moment they realized who had arrived, they fled in panic, buckets, crates, and barrels left behind in their haste. In these mid-ocean ports, piracy was still a rarity, and the Crown's navy maintained a tight grip on trade routes. A single glance at Charles's ship was enough to send merchants and dockhands scrambling for safety. Unperturbed, Charles supervised as his men loaded up barrels of water, sacks of flour, fresh fruit, and salted fish. On this visit, he had kept the black flag stowed away, opting for discretion over defiance. Within 20 minutes, the hold was full, and he motioned for the gangplank to be raised. "Aye, Captain," Paul said, stepping forward. "We've got what we came for. Ready to weigh anchor?" Charles nodded. "Let's get back aboard." They reboarded swiftly, the longboat pulling alongside the main deck. Paul climbed up and saluted. "We've arrived at Chelan Island, sir. Everything's stowed and secured." "Excellent," Charles replied. He paused, glancing at the empty pier. Then, voice ringing clear across the deserted wharf, he called out, "Yo!" Silence greeted him, broken only by the creak of timber as sails unfurled overhead. The islanders were long gone, but their provisions would carry Charles and his crew deeper into the New World. He turned to Paul. Full sail, onward to the grand voyage. As the wind filled the ship's jade-green canvases, Charles pressed his hands against the rail. The next trial lay just beyond the horizon, and he would meet it head-on. A small boat was edging toward the shore through the morning haze. Along the sand, a half-dozen ship escorters lounged, idle and waiting for passing trade. "Look, a vessel's coming in," one of them muttered, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Maybe it wants an escort." At the sound of his voice, the others sat up. Day in, day out, they made their living protecting cargo ships for hire, and here was a fresh client. As the boat nosed into the shallow water, Paul, standing at its prow, shouted back at them, "Excuse me, we need an escort." Instantly, the escorters sprang upright. One bowed eagerly and called out, "My lord, choose me, only 100 Baileys, guaranteed safe and affordable." A second elbowed forward. "Use me, sir, I'll escort you for 90 Baileys flat." A third waved wildly from the back of the line. "Don't trust those two. For 150 million Baileys, I'll personally see you safely past Murloc Island." The would-be guards crowded the boat, each pitching his own deal. Curious, Charles climbed down a step onto the plank and leaned forward to listen. But the instant one escorter caught sight of him, he froze. His mouth fell open, his eyes went wide, and without another word, he dropped his pike and bolted down the beach. The others exchanged terrified glances and scattered after him, tools and shouts left behind. Charles straightened up. "Pardon me, what was that about?" "Run, it's the pirate, Charles." Within moments, every dock worker at Chelan Island's harbor had fled. There wasn't a single soul left to man the quay. Paul stared at Charles in stunned silence. What were they supposed to do now? Even Charles paused, taken aback by the sheer terror his reputation inspired. After a breath, he recovered his composure. "All right," he said, "we'll go ashore and see what's going on. And put up a notice. I want to hire a boatman." He led his dozen-strong crew toward the island. With rumors of his exploits spreading far and wide, Charles was curious to discover what exactly sparked such panic. The settlement they entered was a modest town, much like his hometown of Kame Island, only smaller and without the towering peak he knew so well. Shopfronts opened in neat lines along a single main street, catering to travelers who passed through on their way to or from Murloc Island. No sooner had Charles and his armed men stepped through the gate than every passerby froze. 12 strangers, each gripping a weapon, was enough to halt any ordinary merchant in his tracks. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Pirates!" "They're bandits!" Then someone's eyes widened. "Wait, isn't that Charles?" Recognition spread like wildfire. Faces that had worn wary scowls softened into awe and a trace of fear. The infamy of the pirate captain was plain to see in their expression. Charles offered a small, confident smile. "Paul," he said to his first mate, "post that notice first, then see if you can find us somewhere decent to eat. I'm famished." With that, he strode into the market, his crew following close behind as the townspeople hurried to clear a path, part astonished, part fearful, all unwilling to cross the infamous pirate captain on his home turf. "Blood Swordmaster Charles." The shout echoed through the square, and every head whipped around. Even at a glance, they recognized him, the young swordsman whose name had blasted across the realm in under a month. News of his duel with Zephyr had been splashed across Morgan's Gazette, leaving everyone agape. Now standing before them, he was more legend than flesh and blood. "Quick, run! The Rocks pirates are here!" A panicked villager screamed, and the crowd erupted. Baskets and bundles clattered to the ground as townsfolk bolted in every direction. Only the children playing in the street froze in terror, watching their parents vanish into the maze of alleyways. At the town gate, Charles and his companions remained the sole figures in view. Doors slammed shut, shutters rattled, and frightened villagers huddled behind locked doors. Charles's stern expression softened into a half-smile. Hide indoors? That was the worst thing they could do when pirates raided a town. Those cutthroats would batter down doors and pillage every room. He pushed forward alone, his crimson-bladed sword resting easily at his hip. The wail of an infant stopped him. A small cradle stood abandoned outside a closed fruit stall. Inside, a baby's tears sparkled in the morning light. Charles knelt beside the cradle, his presence suddenly gentle. Around him, the panic raged on, but here he would stand firm. Terrified by his parents' sudden absence, the toddler, no more than 2 or 3 years old, sat on the floor, crying inconsolably. Charles knelt beside him and gently stroked his back. At the comforting touch, the child's tears slowed and then stopped, his big eyes lifting to meet Charles's, with a mix of surprise and relief. Chapter 48. Coding. The residents watched from behind tightly shut shutters and half-cracked doors, jaws clenched. In their fear, the baby's sudden silence could only mean one thing. The pirate out front had killed it. Charles's gentle hand stroking the infant's head reminded them painfully of their own 2-year-old daughters, like little Estes back home. "Hush, don't cry," Charles murmured quietly, his voice soft as a lullaby. Then, as though the child no longer mattered, he turned on his heel and strode to the center of the dusty street. Every eye was on him. From narrow windows and peeking doorways, the islanders dared not breathe. What could this notorious pirate be planning? Charles drew in a slow, deliberate breath and let his voice carry through the hushed crowd. "Listen up," he called. "Send me 10 bodyguards at once, or I'll raze this island to the ground." His words fell like a guillotine blade. That single, imperious demand held a threat so real, everyone felt their throats tighten. No one dared reply. Silence reigned, broken only by the faint coo of the child in Charles's arms. Charles's gaze darkened as he met the crowd's hostile stares. No one dared step forward to challenge him. With a fluid motion, he drew the long sword from his waist. Then, in one sweeping arc, he unleashed a blade of shimmering energy down the length of the street. The sword key carved through cobblestones and shop fronts alike, shattering tile and splintering wood in its wake. When the glowing arc finally struck the building at the street's end, it detonated the facade in a thunderous crash. The structure collapsed instantly, burying every person inside beneath mounds of rubble. Charles had 2 reasons for this demonstration of power. First, to cow the onlookers into submission, and second, because the man he targeted, hidden in that doomed building, had been transmitting intelligence through a concealed listening device. From the intercepted messages, Charles knew the man was a spy for the world government. And spies, in Charles's code, never lived to tell the tale. Chapter 7. The Reluctant Volunteer. Charles's voice rang out cold and unyielding across the silent town hall. "I'll say it one more time. Round up 10 painters and send them to coat my ship immediately, or so help me, my patience will run out." A tense hush fell over the assembled townspeople. None dared meet his icy glare or step forward. Charles's brow furrowed ever deeper. "Is my meaning not clear?" he demanded. Just as he was about to launch into another tirade, a young voice spoke up from the back of the hall. "Wait, I'll do it myself. Just let those people go." Charles turned sharply. His crew, lined up behind him, spun around as well, surprised by the interruption. A few of the onlookers whispered among themselves. "Is that Conan?" someone murmured. "Why is he here?" Now stepping into the light was a lanky youth clutching a paint bucket in one hand, a brush in the other. He met Charles's stare with determined calm. "You," Charles said slowly, "you want to coat my ship? Do you even know how?" Conan squared his shoulders and nodded. "I do. My family has been ship painters for generations. I've worked on dozens of vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, even racing yachts. I know my way around a brush." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Just you? No assistants? No guild backing?" "Just me," Conan replied evenly, "but I've never backed down from a job." A ripple of surprise ran through the hall. In the face of Charles's threat, at least one brave soul had stepped forward. Charles stared at Conan for a long moment, then let out a sigh. "Fine," he said at last. "You'll get your paint, your brushes, and 10 days to finish. If you fail, these people stay." He gestured at the townsfolk, who stood frozen with relief and fear. "Start tomorrow at dawn." Conan dipped his brush into the paint and gave Charles a steady nod. The young volunteer had bought everyone a reprieve, and now, in those quiet moments before dawn, it would fall to him alone to prove that skill and core, age could triumph over brute force. Could it be that he truly intended to slaughter everyone on the island? Charles had killed plenty of people in the past, but he'd never actively targeted civilians. Occasionally, innocents were caught in the crossfire, a regrettable consequence when skilled foes forced him to fight in crowded streets or marketplaces. He always apologized afterward, though he kept his emotions carefully in check. In practice, his victims were almost exclusively soldiers, nobles, merchants, anyone who truly stood in his way. Sometimes a king would order the execution of a handful of citizens during a mission, but even then, the body count remained low. Most deaths under his banner were the work of his lieutenants. Charles himself handled only the hardest targets, the so-called hard bones, and they were few and far between. Only those stubborn souls who misjudged him ever dared to provoke the wrath of the captain, and he dispatched them without hesitation. "All right," Charles said finally, his voice level. "Once I've reinforced my ship, I'll release everyone on this island." "Are you serious?" Conan asked, brows knitting in disbelief. The words slipped out and immediately pained him. "Damn it," he cursed under his breath. "Who do you think our captain is?" Chapter 12. How dare you question the captain? Are you trying to get yourself killed? Before Charles could even open his mouth, Paul sprang to his feet, fury burning in his young eyes. Charles couldn't help but grin and give his brother a proud thumbs up, exactly what he wanted to see, someone willing to defend their leader when it mattered most. Conan's face drained of color. Cold sweat beaded on his brow as he threw his hands up in frantic denial. No, you've got it all wrong. I would never." His words died on his lips. Charles gave a single nod. "Fine, go find the coat maker. I promise you, I won't break my word." Conan visibly relaxed. Thank you, Captain." He ran off toward the outskirts of town, already plotting his next move. Charles turned to Paul. "Come on, let's get out of here before things go sideways again." Together, they slipped away down the crooked lane, leaving behind the uproar of angry shouts and clanging hammers. The square slowly emptied, dust swirling in the footprints they left behind. Then, from a shadowed corner, a terrified cry pierced the air. "Child! My child!" A young woman burst into the light, her skirts trailing as she dashed toward a small wooden cradle at the edge of the plaza. Kneeling beside it, she gathered the limp bundle to her breast, her tears glistening in the fading sun. "Oh, my sweet baby, what's happened to you?" Her anguished whisper hung in the quiet twilight, and a new mystery, one that threatened to unravel everything, settled over the silent town. The square by the docks had never seen such a commotion. At the cry of "My baby! That wretched pirate has hurt my child!" a dozen townsfolk rushed forward, concern etched on their faces. A cluster of well-dressed merchants hovered at the edge, their polished boots scuffing the cobblestones as they exchanged disapproving glances. None dared speak directly, only bitter sighs and haughty shrugs betrayed their indignation. Oh no, the young mother murmured, panic tightening her voice as she rummaged through the bloodstains on her skirt. At her touch, the infant she'd thought lost let out a startled wail. Relief washed over her features in an instant. "He's alive! My little one is all right!" She pressed him to her chest, tears flowing, and showered his face with hurried kisses. The merchants, who'd so readily blamed the pirates, fell silent, their scolding swallowed by the mother's joy. Unbothered by the display, Charles turned on his heel and beckoned the young shipwright who'd been waiting nearby. "Conan, come with me," he said, striding toward his own vessel. Together they climbed aboard, and Charles surveyed the massive hull moored just ahead. At nearly 50 meters from bow to stern, it dwarfed the 30-meter coasters that usually called this port home. He folded his arms. "All right, then. How long before she's seaworthy again?" Conan swallowed hard, his hand unconsciously brushing a loose plank. I'll need 2 days, Captain." Charles nodded once, eyes never leaving the great ship's timbers. 2 days it is. Get to work." With that, the pair set off down the gangplank, leaving the square's lingering murmurs, and a relieved mother cradling her child, behind them. 2 days, the young man repeated, his voice low and menacing. "That's all the time you get. If you have any accomplices, send them to me. I'll pay 300 million Baileys. But don't come back empty-handed. I want results in 48 hours. Otherwise, well, you know what happens." Charles met his gaze coolly, every muscle tensing at the implied threat. Chapter 49. Drinking. 2 days will do it. I'll have the coating finished by then." Conan didn't dare question Charles. After all, he was the captain, and a pirate to boot. He wouldn't risk the safety of an entire town on a whim. With that settled, Charles ducked below decks to catch a few hours' rest. Not 10 seconds later, Paul, the bosun, cleared his throat and approached the rail. "Boss, mind if we slip into town for a drink?" He cast a nervous glance at Charles, then at the eager faces of the crew behind him. It had been nearly half a month at sea, and a little shore leave was well overdue. Charles yawned, stretched his arms, and offered a grin. "Why not? Let's go." A roar of approval went up from the deck. Paul threw his hands into the air. "Drinks are on the boss." "Yeah, on the boss," echoed more than 20 voices in unison. Charles laughed, clapped Paul on the shoulder, and raised a hand to quiet them. "All right, it's settled. Tonight, I'm treating. Follow me." With that, Charles led his boisterous crew down the gangplank and into the waiting streets of the town, their laughter and footsteps carrying them straight toward the nearest tavern. Conan cast a worried glance over the town's rooftops. There was nothing he could do now. He could only hope the pirates lived up to their promise. Behind him, more than 20 of Charles's men strode confidently into the square. The townsfolk who dared to venture out earlier shrieked and scattered, fleeing back into every nook and alley. Watching them bolt again, Charles rolled his eyes in exasperation. With a sharp click of his heels, Charles vanished in a flicker of motion and reappeared inches from a terrified villager who was mid-flight. He yanked the man by the collar and growled, "Hey, where's the tavern in this town?" The villager froze, eyes bulging, mouth opening in a wordless scream. "Ah! Ah!" he squealed, wriggling uselessly. "I said one more peep and I'll tear your tongue out," Charles threatened, his voice low and dangerous. The man's scream died instantly. He clamped a hand over his mouth, trembling so violently his knees nearly buckled. Charles leaned in, gaze icy. "Where is it?" Voice shaking, the villager pointed down the main street. "That way, second building on your right." Charles released him with a grunt. Without another word, he turned and strode off, his boots clicking on the cobblestones. The man slumped against the wall, still too stunned to move. Conan watched from the edge of the square, hope and unease warring in his expression. Only time would tell if the pirates would keep their side of the bargain. Charles followed the townspeople's pointing fingers down a narrow alley. In an instant, he spotted it. A spacious, dimly lit tavern, tucked between two crumbling stone buildings. A quick glance told him there were half a dozen more just beyond, but this one called to him most insistently. With a snap of decision, Charles shoved the nearest villager aside, then strode forward, 20 of his rough-looking compatriots at his back. He planted his boot against the tavern's heavy wooden door and shoved. It crashed open with a thud that echoed down the alley. "Master!" Charles roared, stepping inside. "Bring us every scrap of food and every drop of your finest wine." His 20 comrades spilled through the doorway behind him, grinning and hollering, "This way, gentlemen! Please, right this way!" The lone innkeeper, a gaunt man in a stained vest, backed up against the bar as the newcomers filed in. His eyes darted from Charles to the eager faces behind him. With a trembling voice, he tried to speak. "Please, sirs." "Not so fast," Charles snapped, advancing until the innkeeper had nowhere left to retreat. He grabbed the man by the collar, hauling him close. "You heard me. Best food, best wine, everything you've got." The innkeeper's knees hit the floor. "My lord, forgive me. I'll bring it all right away. Please don't." Charles let go. The innkeeper collapsed against the floorboards, panting. Behind them, the pirates clapped and ped. Trinkets on the bar rattled, the candles flickered. Just then, footsteps pounded overhead as if someone had sprinted down the upper hallway. A clear, breathless voice rang out, "My Lord Charles!" Charles glanced up, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Now, this should be interesting." Charles paused in the doorway, just as the tavern's manager went down on his knees before a stern, crew-cut man in a tuxedo. "My Lord Charles," the manager cried, bowing his head to the stranger. "Please forgive my men's insolence. I beg your pardon, and I promise they'll face no harsh punishment this time." Charles frowned. This man clearly wasn't nobility. He looked every bit a hardened pirate. Stepping forward, Charles asked quietly, "Excuse me, are you the owner of this place?" The manager snapped upright, panic in his eyes. Yes, he is. The young man is the proprietor here." The crew-cut pirate inclined his head once. "Fine, then bring us all your best wines and food. My brothers are starving." Charles turned, gesturing to the hulking gang of more than 20 men clustered near the back wall. Each was sunburned and leathery from time at sea, eyes flashing with impatience. The manager broke into a cold sweat. Of course, the manager stammered. Right away. Please have a seat. With that, Charles took the nearest empty stool at a long wooden table. The pirate crew followed him, spreading out along the benches. Then, in perfect unison, they pounded the table, bellowing, "Wine! Wine! Wine!" Charles's sudden glare froze the tavern owner in his tracks. This, the startled man stammered, sweat beading on his forehead as his eyes flicked between Charles and the 20-odd pirates lounging in the common room. Clearing his throat, the landlord hurried forward. "Captain Charles, sir, right away we'll bring the wine. Please, just give us a moment." His hand shook as he dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief. Charles reached out, lightly grasping the man's wrist, and met his gaze coolly. "Tell me, innkeeper, are you afraid of me?" The innkeeper's face went pale, but he straightened, forcing a shaky smile. "Lord Captain, you are the infamous pirate Charles, wanted for 5 million gold. A humble tavern owner like myself would be a fool not to tremble." Charles released his grip, laughter rumbling in his chest. "Is that so? I hope my reputation precedes me," he said, an amused spark in his eyes as the pirates around him broke into approving cheers. Charles leaned back in his chair, a lazy grin spreading across his face as Paul slapped him on the shoulder. "Ha! Boss, you're officially a Navy fugitive now. Enjoy that." Paul laughed, but Charles merely waved him off. "Enough talk. Where's the wine? Bring it here." At Charles's command, several burly waiters appeared and set a half-dozen dusty bottles on the table. Without hesitation, Charles picked one at random, yanked off the cork, and tipped the neck back. The rich, amber liquid gurgled down in a single, triumphant gulp. He slammed the empty bottle onto the table. "Not bad. Your captain can really drink." His crew roared in approval, slapping the table and cheering. "That's more like it. On your tab tonight, boss. If you don't get plastered, you owe us breakfast." Charles chuckled and reached for another bottle. As he poured himself a full glass, his mind drifted back to a moment earlier that evening when he'd grabbed the tavern owner's wrist. He'd needed to be sure the man wasn't about to spring some underhanded trap on them. A quick dive into the owner's thoughts told him everything. This guy was nothing more than a local gang boss, the proprietor of several taverns in the area, and, beyond a touch of opportunism, harbored no ill will toward his guests. In fact, the man treated Charles as if he were some fearsome deity of pestilence, an image Charles had no wish to dispel. He simply wanted the tavern owner to fawn over him, to keep the ale flowing and hurry their departure once they'd had their fill. It was a harmless ruse, after all. No one here suspected a thing, and it would make slipping away all the easier. Raising his glass in a mock salute, Charles shot Paul a wry grin. "Next round's on me. Let's see how far we can push this celebration before dawn." The pirates cheered anew, and the tavern's lanterns danced as glasses clinked and laughter echoed into the night. I'd be happy to help transform the entire chapter into smooth, idiomatic English and rename Charlotte to Charles. Could you please paste the full chapter text here? That way I can ensure I preserve every plot point and detail as I revise. Chapter 50. How much money? Charles awoke with a groan, head throbbing from the previous night's festivities. Blinking against the dim morning light, he found himself slumped over a low table in the tavern's lobby. All around him lay bodies of burly men, his companions from last night's revelry, sprawled in awkward positions, snoring softly or moaning in their stupor. A sudden urge reminded him he'd been saving bathroom time for later. Charles staggered to his feet, wincing as his mind swirled. He navigated past fallen chairs and discarded mugs, finally reaching the washroom. A few moments at the basin, splashing cool water on his face, and he already felt slightly more human. Back in the lobby, the tavern's boss, a crew-cut man with broad shoulders and an anxious expression, rushed over. "Master Charles, you're awake." He bowed, careful not to jostle the tables coated in last night's spill. Charles gave him a tired smile and clasped the man's hand. "Breakfast, and a bowl of your strongest hangover soup," he ordered. "I need to sober up before I think straight." The boss's eyes widened, as if Charles had just requested the moon. "Certainly, Master Charles." He hurried off, then paused, glanced back at Charles with a mixture of awe and trepidation, and disappeared into the kitchen. Charles eased himself into a clean chair by the window, leaning back as he surveyed the wreckage of the night before. A few minutes later, a timid waiter appeared, placing a steaming bowl of the tavern's famed soup before him. The rich aroma of ginger and herbs rose in gentle wisps, promising relief. Charles wrapped his hands around the warm bowl, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. This, he decided, was exactly what he needed, along with a clear head to sort out the day's real business. How much money did he owe? For now, Charles had nothing pressing to do. The seas were growing restless with piracy. Give it another 10 years, once Roger's famed voyage was underway, and half the ships afloat would fly a black flag. By then, no one would bat an eye at rogues and brigands. But for the moment, he could afford to loaf. He sat in a dim corner of the harbor tavern, the early morning light filtering through smoke-stained windows. A bowl of the local hangover soup sat before him, a thin, reeking broth that was supposed to soothe a sore head. Charles had drained it with a grunt and leaned back, closing his eyes to savor the faint warmth spreading through his stomach. Before he could settle further into his seat, a lanky waiter appeared, setting down an enormous platter of sizzling barbecued meat. Each piece hissed and spit as it met the hot iron plate, tendrils of steam curling toward the ceiling. Charles's mouth watered. He reached out, picked up the first skewer, and, heedless of its heat, crammed the entire chunk of pork into his mouth. He gnawed once, swallowed, and set the empty skewer aside. Without pausing, he dove straight into the next piece. The young waiter stood rooted to the spot, eyes wide. At last, Charles cast him a look of mild reproach. "You going to stand there, or are you bringing more?" "Yes, sir," the flustered boy stammered, snatching the platter and racing off. Up on the tavern's wooden balcony, the owner watched with a half-amused, half-astounded expression. "What a monster," he muttered under his breath. Oblivious, Charles resumed his feast. Around him, his crew, who'd spent the night drinking themselves into a stupor, began to wake, blinking at their own bowls and stretching out stiff limbs. Dawn was breaking over the harbor, and with it came the first stirrings of a new day's dangers and opportunities. Charles sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, a steaming platter of roasted boar set before him. His lieutenant Paul slid onto the bench opposite and, eyes gleaming, reached out to snag a hunk of meat. "Not so fast," Charles said, snatching Paul's wrist mid-lung. With a sharp twist and a flick of his hand, he sent Paul crashing into the wooden wall. Thud. "Doesn't matter how big or small," Charles muttered, airing a piece of boar and bringing it to his lips. "No one grabs my meat." Several crewmen who'd been gathered nearby rushed over, alarmed at Paul's twisted hand. But Charles paid them no mind. He chewed casually and called, "Paul." From the loft above, the pirate captain, Charles's boss, leaned over the railing, wide-eyed. "Cough? Seriously?" he croaked, baffled by the ruthless efficiency of his own lieutenant. Paul slid from the wall, dusting himself off and coughing once or twice. Bracing himself, he returned to the table and glared up at Charles. "Boss, how could you do that?" Charles merely shrugged and swallowed. "Wait your turn." Paul's face fell, then reddened with indignation. He stamped his foot. "Fine, but bring me something to eat before I starve, would you? You want your poor uncle dead of hunger?" With that, he stormed off toward the galley. Charles lifted his fork again, a satisfied grin tugging at his lips, and continued his dinner as if nothing had happened. The tavern owner, perched on the second-floor balcony, wiped cold sweat from his brow as he stared down at the table. "Wait a moment. Hold on." He waved frantically to his head chef. "Hurry up with those dishes." Then, with mounting desperation, he thundered down the stairs, shouting at the nearby inns and taverns. "Chefs, I need you now." Within minutes, extra cooks filled the kitchen, chopping, sautéing, and lining up plates. Below, Charles leaned back in his chair and let out a satisfied belch. His stomach bulged grotesquely, then, in the span of a heartbeat, contracted back to normal size. The tavern owner's jaw dropped. "What?" He staggered backward. "What a monster!" As he watched Charles calmly toss aside a wine-stained napkin, a dark curiosity flared in the owner's mind. If such a man could consume so much, might he also be, well, delectable? The thought both horrified and intrigued him. He squashed it down, instead promising himself more and richer meals served to this extraordinary guest. Charles, however, remained entirely unaware of the owner's scheming. He propped one boot casually on the edge of the wooden table, pulled a toothpick from his pocket, and began picking at a stray crumb. "Isaac," he called to his steward, "bring the money chest. It's time to settle up. How much do I owe?" Isaac glanced at the ledger, swallowed, and replied, "My lord, the total comes to 290 million Bailey coins." At the mention of that staggering sum, the tavern owner practically beamed. He scurried down the stairs, smoothing his apron into a semblance of dignity. Sliding to one knee beside Charles, he pressed a hand to his heart and forced a courteous bow. "Sir Charles," he said, voice warm with practiced hospitality, "it has been the honor of my establishment to serve you. How may we continue to exceed your expectations this evening?" Charles stared at the invoice in disbelief. "You think I'd lose money on this order? Don't forget, if Lord Charles pays, the pirates pay too." With a loud poochie, the wine Charles had just sipped sprayed from his mouth and landed squarely on the boss's face. The heavy bottle clattered onto the table. "How much?" Charles demanded, eyes narrowing. The boss forced a courteous smile, though every fiber of his being itched to rough Charles up. Since inheriting his late father's gang, he'd never been disrespected like this. 290,000 Baileys. No, let's call it 3 million Baileys, my lord. I'll round up to 30 million to keep the numbers clean. 30 million! Charles couldn't hide his shock. He leaned forward, every muscle taut. If the profiteer didn't explain himself, Charles would gladly demonstrate his own version of Cheka Island's top 10 tortures. "My lord," the boss stammered, desperately straightening his soaked coat, "the wine you ordered yesterday, there simply isn't anything finer. We gathered every rare vintage we could find, from the East China Sea and the South China Sea, the Western and Northern waters, even from the Grand Line and the New World. It's the Baal-esque collection in the entire shop." Charles swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He'd come for a simple toast, not a small fortune's worth of champagne. As the boss looked on, soaked and trembling, Charles weighed his next move. Accept the bill, or let the boss learn firsthand just how powerful a pirate lord could be. Charles scowled at the innkeeper's upward-turned palm. "You're telling me it's more expensive now?" The innkeeper's face went pale. He stared at Charles, incredulous. A pirate with a 5 billion berry bounty couldn't cough up 3 billion for a single meal? It had to be a joke. Charles pressed his jaw into a hard line. "Isaac, bring 3 billion berries to the ship." He couldn't believe they were haggling over prices like this. 3 billion berries for one dinner. Practically extortion. Isaac, who'd been twirling a dinner plate in one hand, set it down and strode out of the room, his sword clinking at his hip. The innkeeper, overhearing Charles's order, could barely hide his satisfaction. He let out a snort of triumph, then forced on a respectful smile as he hurried to Charles's side, wary of saying anything that might spook the pirate captain. Charles bit back his anger. 3 billion berries for a single meal, enough to outstrip even Luffy's first bounties. This was nothing but profiteering. The more I dwell on it, the angrier and more unsettled I become. Slam! "Hey, boss, another round of barbecue plates, please." Charles hammered his palm against the table and roared. He was determined to channel his grief and fury into a voracious appetite. Chapter 51. Undersea Crisis. After 2 days stranded on Cheka Island, Charles had blown nearly 5 billion berries, half his entire savings. Swearing he'd never set foot on that miserable rock again, he stood on the deck of his submersible and gave a single command: sink. Slowly, the vessel sank beneath the waves. Through the reinforced glass, Charles watched schools of iridescent fish swirl around him, jellyfish pulsing with ghostly light, and unfamiliar shapes drifting in the deep. His heart pounded with excitement and a touch of nervous wonder. He'd only ever seen such creatures in aquariums, never in the open sea, and certainly never at this depth. The submersible continued its descent, the sunlight above fading from brilliant blue to dusky gray. Soon the outside world was cloaked in darkness, save for a distant, faint glow. Charles remembered Paulo's words. This was the lantern light of Yangshu Eve, the luminous plant that bathes Fishman Island in perpetual twilight. Below the red earth continent, the hidden path to Fishman Island was the only way across the seafloor, and that pale lantern light marked the entrance. Charles glanced at his crew. None of them wanted to linger beneath the waves longer than necessary. They'd stay only one night on Fishman Island, gather what supplies they needed, then push on. The Red Earth continent still lay far ahead, and time, as always, was not on their side. Charles never intended to pause his voyage for the sake of the Fishman young lady. After all, he was no lecher. As their ship plunged through the inky waters toward Fishman Island, his thoughts began to drift. The endless darkness of the sea pressed in around him, and before long, he dozed off. A sudden, low-frequency rumble snapped him awake. Charles's heart skipped a beat as he remembered. They were now nearly 500 meters below the surface, in the very depths where so many ships vanish forever. Nearly 80% of all vessels passing Fishman Island meet their doom here, dragged down by the massive sea kings. If that tremor had been a warning growl from one of those beasts, they could be in immediate peril. Instinctively, Charles activated his observation Haki. In the crushing depths, its usual range was drastically reduced, but even so, he swept his senses through the surrounding water. There, he murmured, eyes narrowing. Almost 30 sea kings drifted into focus. Most lay dormant, their great bodies swaying with the currents, but a handful prowled restlessly, their huge eyes opening and closing as they searched for disturbance. Careful not to make a sound, Charles held his breath. If those wandering sea kings saw any hint of movement, they'd alert the rest, and this expedition would end before it even began. He needed to think fast. With painstaking calm, he readied himself for whatever came next, determined not to become another lost casualty at the bottom of the sea. It can't be that unlucky, can it? Charles peered into the ink-black waters, his seasoned sailor's instincts screaming that something enormous loomed just beyond the glow of their underwater lights. Through the rolling darkness, he made out the outline of a colossal sea king, easily 40 meters long, drifting toward their vessel. On the surface, such a leviathan would be a miracle catch, a banquet for the whole crew. Down here, however, it spelled disaster. A cold sweat trickled down Charles's spine. Around him, the crew milled about the deck, tense but oblivious. In this gloom, with only their faltering lamps to cut through the abyss, they would never see the danger until it was upon them. Beyond the circle of light, the ocean was an unbroken void. Ming! A sonorous whale cry reverberated through the hull. It was louder now, so close that the entire boat shuddered. At last, heads snapped up and eyes found Charles. They'd assumed his frown was from nerves in the deep. None expected a sea king to be shadowing their keel. "Boss! Boss!" someone finally yelled, scrambling toward him. The deck heaved as the water surged beneath, and the flocky lights flickered with the beast's movements. Charles gripped the rail, heart pounding. They had only seconds to prepare before the Sea King struck. "What do we do?" Paul's voice quivered as he edged in front of Charles. "Quiet," Charles muttered under his breath. There was no way a Sea King could hear them at this distance, right? But then came that low, resonant call from the deep. "Ming!" Charles froze. His Kenbunshoku Haki flared to life, alerting him that a massive presence was closing in, already within 50 meters of the ship. He pressed himself against the railing, mind racing. In his previous life, he'd watched One Piece and memorized how characters face down Neptunes in the abyss. Knowledge and Haki fused in his thoughts, urgency tightening his chest. If he didn't act now, this very deck would be torn apart. A memory surfaced. Rayleigh wielding Conqueror's Haki with devastating effect. Conqueror's Haki, of course, he breathed. With a sharp cry, Charles slammed his fist into his open palm. As the Sea Kings breached the 10-meter mark, he unleashed his willpower in a silent roar. An invisible wave of Haki cascaded outward, pressing against the leviathans in the water and holding them at bay. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Then the Sea Kings recoiled, their low calls faltering under the weight of his presence. Charles stood firm, heart pounding, ready for whatever came next. A sharp cry rang out, and the enormous Sea King, a 40-meter-long behemoth, lashed its tail and darted toward the far side of the ship, squealing in terror like a child crying for its mother. Under Charles's imposing, knowledge-infused aura, the creature's massive form seemed to blur and vanish into the depths. A faint smile curved at the corners of his mouth. The immediate threat had passed, and the ominous warning in his mind had dissolved. Charles realized that his ability to sense danger worked very differently from Charlotte Katakuri's famous future sight decades later. His premonitions only flared when a threat was imminent, more like the spider sense of Marvel's Spider-Man from his former life than the long-range prophecies common in One Piece. Even more intriguing, it appeared this talent could be refined with practice. Perhaps he could seize the opportunity now to hone it. Oddly enough, he had never consciously cultivated his domineering aura before, but that, he decided, was about to change. From the moment I awakened, I discovered that my knowledge and arrogance were growing on their own. I didn't have to practice or cultivate them. My overlord aura, too, swelled in power without effort. As I learned to command its domineering strain, the aura's intensity kept climbing, and when I trained in the entanglement technique of the overlord color, its arrogance surged faster than ever. I often wondered why my insight and confidence felt so unnatural. Finally, after long reflection, I reached a clear conclusion. As a time traveler, my soul had fused with the original deceased soul of Charles, merging into a single, twice as potent spirit. That fusion explained the uncanny depth of my knowledge and the overwhelming force of my presence. On top of that, mastering the return-of-life technique turned out to be astonishingly easy. Having already studied the Navy's 6 styles, I could channel restorative energy through my body almost instinctively. Undoubtedly, my soul's exceptional strength made every process, mental, spiritual, and physical, effortless. No wonder I've grown so powerful so quickly. By the time he was 11 or 12, Charles discovered that a simple daily regimen of exercise was all he needed to fuel his rapid growth, and he hardly gave a second thought to meals or rest. Even the most arcane secrets of swordsmanship seemed to unfold before him with remarkable ease. In no time at all, he was mastering techniques that usually took years to learn. This astonishing progress had a single source. Charles's soul and spirit were twice as potent as those of ordinary people. He often attributed his uncanny aptitude to the martial novel he'd absorbed in a past life. Its lessons so deeply etched in his mind that they felt like second nature. Chapter 52, Fishman Island. In the skyfighting novels, Xiaohuohuo is portrayed as a time traveler whose soul power far outstrips that of ordinary practitioners. Of course, it's just a fictional explanation, but for now, it's the only one that fits. Thanks to that extraordinary soul force, Xiaohuohuo broke through to the rank of doge at only 11 years old and quickly mastered medicinal alchemy. Following his example, Charles devoted himself almost entirely to cultivating his armed hue, refining his swordsmanship, and tempering his overlord hue. He scarcely touched the knowledge hue, preferring to let it grow in the background. That decision proved crucial. By focusing on physical conditioning and sword techniques while letting the hues develop naturally, Charles rose in strength faster than anyone expected, without ever having to force himself to practice every single art. Now, he was nearly 18. He'd reached that milestone in less than 3 months. For comparison, Monkey D. Luffy had only become one of the 4 emperors at 19, tying the record set by Zephyr, who hadn't reached his peak until he was 17. Charles was making excellent time. He couldn't help but think that he was well on his way. If Paul, standing beside him, knew what Charles was thinking, he'd curse under his breath. Since overhearing Charles claim he'd broken through to Grand Swordsman 2 days ago at the tavern on Cheka Island, Paul had been in a daze. He'd assumed Charles was about 20, a generous estimate, he thought, yet that had still wildly underestimated the boy's potential. Just then, Isaac's voice rang out. "Captain, Murloc Island ahead!" Charles snapped out of his reverie and hurried to the bow. All around him, the sea glowed with a muted light as sunlight filtered down from above. It wasn't as brilliant as daylight on land, but in these depths it was a rare and welcome sight. No wonder the Murlocs or merfolk longed to reach the surface. Even this dim glow lifted the spirits after days in the gloom. The ship broke through the final shimmer of the island's protective barrier, and with a thunderous crack, bang, they sailed into the unknown. The ship's outer plating cracked with a sharp snap, sending metal shards clattering across the deck. In the next heartbeat, its prow slammed into Fishman Island's wooden pier. A booming voice crackled over the harbor loudspeakers. "Attention, everyone! Incoming vessel, Captain Charles, the pirate." At the docks, the gate guards jolted to attention. Captain Charles was no ordinary marauder. His exploits in the New World were already the stuff of legend. One sentry shouted above the din, "Sound the alarm! Inform King Neptune at once. Pirates have breached our waters." A piercing siren split the air, its echoes bouncing off coral spires and winding tunnels. Within moments, the warning had swept across every district of Fishman Island, sending soldiers and citizens alike into a frenzy of preparation. Leaning nonchalantly against the shattered railing, Charles watched the chaos unfold with narrowed eyes. Where others might have bowed or cowered, these guards fumbled with their spears, knuckles white from nervous grips. His smile turned cold. One guard finally mustered the courage to step forward, voice trembling. "You're not welcome here, Pirate Charles. Turn your ship around and depart, now." Charles's dark gaze locked on the guard. The island had issued its challenge. He only needed to decide whether he'd accept it. "Leave now." The lead guard strode forward, eyes steely as he faced Charles. Boss, I don't think our friends here are all that welcoming." Paul, captain of their ragtag pirate band, unsheathed the western sword at his hip, a fierce glint in his eye. Ever since he'd heard that Charles had ascended to great swordsman rank, Paul felt desperate to keep pace. He had to grow stronger, or risk being left behind by his master. No sooner had he drawn his blade than the rest of the crew followed suit, leveling cutlasses and daggers at the guards. A clanging alarm echoed across the causeway. Armored squads rushed forward from Murloc Island's walls, short spears bristling like porcupine quills. As they reached the narrow bridge leading ashore, one guard bellowed above the din, "Blood, Lord Charles, the blood sword!" At the forefront stood a Murloc general, broad-shouldered, painted war green, and utterly incredulous. He fixed Charles with a look of disbelief. Charles pressed a palm to his forehead in exasperation. "Not again. Another officer who recognizes me. Great. All I wanted was a simple visit to Fishman Island. Why does it have to be so complicated?" Charles perched on the ship's prow, one hand shading his forehead, the other clutching the rail. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, then burst into unrestrained laughter that echoed across the water. "Ha! So you came to stop me?" Below him, nearly 1,000 Murloc Island guards formed a tight cordon on the beach, their spears and tridents glinting in the morning light. Nervous whispers rippled through the ranks at the sound of his hoarse, ringing laughter. Finally, the grizzled Murloc commander at the front, clearly the senior officer, stepped forward, his voice booming. "Pirate Charles, we have no desire for conflict. Leave our shores now, or we will be forced to defend our island." Even on remote Murloc Island, hundreds of meters beneath the surface of the New World, rumors of sudden invasions and sacked kingdoms traveled fast. The commander clearly hoped fear of those tales would cow the young pirate. Charles lowered his hand slowly and met the Murloc captain's glare with cool amusement. His laughter died away, but the light in his eyes remained playful. "Is that a threat?" he asked. "If you think you can stop me, come on. I'm waiting." A tense silence settled over the beach as the Murloc guards exchanged uncertain glances. The commander swallowed hard. Charles knew he didn't owe them any explanations, and for once, neither did he intend to give one. Charles's grin only deepened the Fishman commander's alarm. The fear he dreaded most was unfolding before him. As Charles's crazed smile settled across his face, the commander's expression twisted into pure hatred. "Murloc karate, rubber tiles," he barked. At his command, a Murloc guard lunged forward with a feeble karate chop aimed at Charles. The blow barely rustled Charles's coat. With a single amused glance, Charles turned up the corners of his mouth. He didn't even bother to dodge. Surrounded by more than 1,000 snarling Murlocs, Charles's mind drifted back to the stories of Luffy's triumph on Murloc Island. The shock and awe that felled an entire horde with nothing more than sheer swagger. It lit a spark in his eyes. A palpable wave of force radiated outward, centering on Charles like the eye of a storm. Bang! The first Murloc flew backward, crashing into its comrades. Bang! A second went down, foam bubbling at its mouth. Bang! After that, there was no stopping it. With each thunderous pulse of Charles's aura, another Murloc hit the deck, incapacitated. One disoriented guard croaked hoarsely, "Cut, boss! Not again with this domineering look. But, hell, it really works, doesn't it?" Paul, standing a few paces away, slid his sword back into its sheath. He curled his lip, unable to hide his envy. That towering presence, the very definition of the fishman nemesis, had just single-handedly wiped out more than 1,000 Murloc guards, and Charles wore it like a badge of honor. Only the Murloc general still struggled to stand, his legs wobbling beneath him. Gasping for breath, he managed only, unbelievable, such overwhelming presence. General Fishman Island stared at Charles in stunned silence. He'd never imagined this young pirate could project such absolute dominance. Why would someone with that aptitude ever bow to another? Then the truth hit him. Charles was none other than the feared captain of the 8th Division of the Rocks Pirates. "Old 8, little snake, all units on me," the general roared. From the shadows behind, countless Murloc guards surged forward, eager to crush their foe. But the instant they stepped into Charles's aura, their eyes glazed over. Foam bubbled at their mouths as each warrior toppled unconscious in turn. Terrified, the remaining fighters skidded to a halt, adrenaline flaring. They recoiled in panic, hastily retreating out of Charles's reach. From a safe distance, they shouted for reinforcements, unwilling to challenge the young captain whose very presence felled them like saplings in a storm. Chapter 53. Charles leaped from the ship's bow and strode toward the towering Murloc general. The creature, nearly 5 meters tall, was forced to one knee under Charles's unyielding glare, shrinking him to about 4 meters. Though Charles technically had to look up, the sheer force of his presence made it feel as if he were towering over the giant. "Still think you can stop me?" Charles asked, his voice cold and steady. The blue-skinned general bared his tusks in a snarl. "I am Shen Kun, general of Fishman Island." Even kneeling, his chest swelled with pride and defiance. "No one, absolutely no one, shall harm Murloc Island while I live." Charles tilted his head, studying the warrior before him. Shen Kun's skin was the same deep sea blue, his thick tail coiling behind him like a serpent. 2 blunt tusks jutted from the corners of his mouth. The name Shen Kun rang a distant bell in Charles's mind. Jinbei, one of the 7 Seas' legendary kings, was known in 30 years' time as Haishia Jinbei. Could this formidable general be his father? What an incredible coincidence. A tense silence stretched between them. Charles met Shen Kun's fierce gaze without wavering, trying to piece together this unexpected revelation. Whatever the answer, the battle for Murloc Island was far from over. Charles's stern glare slipped away as he withdrew his domineering posture. Instantly, Shen Kun, who had been half kneeling, straightened and took a few hurried steps forward. "Captain Charles, Murloc Island has no wish to fight the Lock Pirates. Please spare us." Without hesitation, Shen Kun dropped to his knees and bowed his head low. Charles blinked in surprise. For a moment, the sight of that humble submission tugged at something deep inside him, stirring an odd sense of déjà vu. He cleared his throat and answered quietly, "Relax. I don't want to lay waste to Murloc Island. I merely need safe passage and a day's rest. After that, I'll be on my way." At those words, Shen Kun lowered himself even further, forehead almost touching the wooden deck. "Thank you, Captain Charles. Thank you for your mercy." His gratitude rang genuine. Shen Kun well understood that if Charles had truly intended to slaughter the inhabitants of Fishman Island, no force there could have stood in his path. Now, with the danger averted, he could breathe easier, at least for another day. Charles stands before the gate of Fishman Island, his expression calm and unyielding. The Murloc guards he confronted lie scattered at his feet, frothing at the mouth, yet in his eyes they're nothing more than insignificant obstacles. "Take me to Fishman Island," he says, his voice steady. "This is my first time there." At once Shen Kun, the island's guide, scrambles to his feet, eager to serve. "Captain Charles, please allow me. I'll show you everything Fishman Island has to offer." He bows hastily, stretching out his hand in welcome. Charles offers a polite smile as he takes it. He understands Shen Kun's enthusiasm. There's no point in resisting curiosity when a willing host is at hand. Better to walk alongside him than to invite needless trouble. More than 20 islanders, a mix of mermen, mermaids, and other fishmen, fall in step behind Shen Kun as they pass through the stone archway into the heart of the city. Despite the bustling crowd around them, Charles can't help but notice furtive glances aimed his way. Clusters of mermen whisper among themselves, and wary mermaids peek from behind coral stone stalls. A young mermaid girl, her turquoise tail shimmering in the dappled light, points at Charles with wide, suspicious eyes. She tugs at her friend's arm and asks in a hushed voice, "Is that a human? But why doesn't he have a fish tail?" Charles felt a prick of discomfort as the young fishman scolded his daughter. "Foolish girl," he snapped. "He's a human's property. That's why he has no tail." All around, similar murmurs rose. Charles had come hoping to meet merfolk and murlocs, legendary beings he'd only heard of in stories. Instead, he and his companions had become curiosities, prodded and whispered about as if they were beasts on display. It stung to be gawked at so crudely. With a slight shrug, Charles turned away. He caught sight of Shen-kun standing nearby, tall and proud in his ornate armor. "Is there a tavern close by?" Charles asked quietly. Shen-kun studied him for a moment. Charles stood nearly 2 meters tall, a stature fit for a general in any world. Shen-kun smiled, as if already anticipating Charles's next request. "Ah, Your Excellency wishes to sample the finest vintages of Fishman Island, does he not?" Charles inclined his head. "Exactly." "Excellent. Follow me." Shen-kun extended an arm in invitation. Charles fell in step beside him, ready to leave the curious gazes behind. Before they could move far, a breathless voice echoed from the street. "General Shen-kun! General Shen-kun!" Shen-kun paused and turned toward the call, his expression sharpening. Charles braced himself. Whatever awaited them next, he would face it head-on. A white and blue murloc guard came sprinting across the courtyard, spear leveled. Shen-kun recognized him immediately as one of the Dragon Palace sentinels. The moment the guard set eyes on Charles standing beside Shen-kun, he froze, too frightened even to speak. Shen-kun frowned, not wanting his guest to be insulted. "What is it? Why this rush?" He stepped forward to intercept the sentinel. The murloc stammered, glancing nervously from Shen-kun to Charles. "General Shen-kun, my prince, he requests an audience with Captain Charles." At those words, Shen-kun's face darkened. He pulled the guard aside and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Absolutely not. Tell the prince that Captain Charles is only here for a day and cannot be disturbed." The guard paled at Shen-kun's firmness, then stuttered, "Yes, General Shen-kun, right away." With that, he spun on his heels and dashed back toward the palace. Shen-kun exhaled and turned back to Charles, breaking into an embarrassed chuckle. "Sorry about that. Our prince is overly curious." "It's quite all right," Charles replied with a casual wave, giving Shen-kun a reassuring smile. Charles cleared his throat. "By the way, what's your prince called?" Shen-kun blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected the question, but there was no harm in answering. "Our prince is named Neptune. He's the king's only son and the heir to the Dragon Palace." The words carried an unspoken warning. Don't start forming any strange ideas. Charles only nodded and murmured, "Prince Neptune." The name made his pulse quicken. Neptune, the very man who would one day rule as the rotund King Neptune. Charles's only real connection to him was through Neptune's daughter. And she wasn't just any child. Neptune Bai Xing was one of the 3 ancient weapons, gifted with the power to command the Sea Kings. On a world where 70% of the surface lay beneath water, the number of Sea Kings was incalculable. Simply thinking about it sent a chill down his spine. Yet this was decades away. How long until Shirahoshi's birth? Too many years to worry about now. And once Bai Xing appeared, Charles could always travel forward in time, accept her formally as his goddaughter, and what an honor that would be. But for the moment, that future could wait. Charles's face flickered for the briefest moment, and Shen-kun felt a tightening in his chest. Was their captain truly up to something, perhaps even plotting like that Prince Neptune rumor suggested? He squared his shoulders and forced his voice to stay calm. "Captain Charles, are we still heading to the tavern?" Shen-kun asked, measuring Charles's reaction. Chapter 54, Wine from Murloc Island. "Go, we have to go. I want to try the famous Murloc Island wine," Charles exclaimed. Shen-kun started in surprise at the sudden enthusiasm, then recovered and dashed off toward the tavern he'd spotted. Paul and the others, ever the wine aficionados, were right on his heels, practically running in excitement. They could already smell the heady aroma of fermenting fruits drifting out the open doorway. With a dramatic flourish, Charles threw out his leg and kicked the door wide in a single, echoing slam. It was his trademark move, forcefully announcing his arrival so no one would dare ignore him. Instantly, every pair of glowing amphibian eyes in the tavern turned to stare. Murlocs, who usually kept to their own kind and rarely saw humans on Fishman Island these days, froze in mid-conversation. "Human?" one of them croaked, incredulous. "A human," the others chorused. In all their decades of trading and travel, it was astonishingly rare for a surface dweller to set foot in a Murloc establishment. Since the end of the Grand Voyage era, most ships bound for the New World bypassed Fishman Island entirely, preferring the safety of government-sanctioned sea lanes. But here, in this dimly lit tavern on the edge of the coral reef, Charles and his companions stood very much alive and very much ready for a glass of legendary Murloc vintage. Charles swept a hand across the room. "We've come a long way to taste your wine. Don't keep us waiting." The Murlocs exchanged nervous glances. Their tails quivered. At last, one braver Murloc bartender, or perhaps simply more curious, stepped forward to find out exactly what these bold surface dwellers intended to do with their prized barrel. Either way, Charles's entrance had made one thing clear. Tonight, the wine of Murloc Island had some very special guests, and nothing would stop him from getting the first taste. Charles knew all too well the system here. Pay a modest toll at the checkpoint, and you'd secure passage through Murloc Island with virtually no risk. The fatality rate was laughably low. By comparison, the route through Fishman Island was a death trap. Only desperate pirates, ruthless outlaws, and mercenary slavers braved those waters, preying on merfolk and strong Murlocs alike. Their plundering had left Murloc Island burned with anger toward any human who set foot on its shores. No sooner had Charles and his companion Shen-kun stepped onto the docks than a crude shout rang out. "Filthy human scum, get off Murloc Island!" An obviously drunk Murloc, eyes bloodshot and face twisted with resentment, hurled an empty wine bottle in Charles's direction. Shen-kun's heart lurched. He pushed forward, panic etched on his features. "Guard, this is—" he began, but the bottle clattered harmlessly into Charles's waiting hand. Charles stood perfectly still, the wine bottle balanced effortlessly in his palm. His gaze locked onto the insolent Murloc, ice running through his expression. Shen-kun darted between them, stammering apologies. "Captain Charles, I'm so sorry. Truly, it's not safe here." But Charles only tipped his chin, cool and unshaken, as the crowd of Murlocs watched in tense silence. The air crackled with the promise of violence. Yet for now, Charles held firm. Captain Charles had just finished answering one druid's overly detailed question when the tavern door burst open and General Shen-kun strode in. "Captain Charles," Shen-kun called out, his voice cutting through the din, "you won't outwit these Murloc drunks with all your know-how." At the sound of his title, the rowdy Murlocs snapped to attention. A hush fell over the room as dozens of webbed feet shuffled uneasily on the wooden floor. "General Shen-kun," they chorused, eyes wide. Shen-kun let out a relieved breath. "Now listen up. Haul these miscreants outside and clear the place. I'll cover every last one of their drinks. On me. Move it." The Murlocs blinked in confusion. Why was the revered general of Murloc Island bending over backward for a human captain? Before they could mutter a protest, Shen-kun gave a slight nod. In response, his spear-bearing guards flooded into the tavern. "General Shen-kun, long live the general!" they roared, wrestling the inebriated Murlocs toward the door one by one, their drunken bellows fading into the night. When the last stumbling Murloc had been escorted out, Shen-kun knelt and carefully picked up the empty wine bottle that Charles had flung earlier. A faint smile curved his lips as he rose, authority fully restored, and perhaps a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Captain Charles, please, allow me to take care of your drinks. Just relax and enjoy yourself." Shen-kun heaved a sigh of relief as he took the empty bottle from Charles's hand. The captain wasn't upset after all. Charles curved his lips into a grin. "All right, everyone. Let loose and drink up." He settled into a freshly swept corner seat. Watching him, Shen-kun couldn't help but wince inwardly. He suspected Charles was about to tear through a frightening amount of wine. Around them, the mermaid waitstaff and the tavern owner stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. Quickly, Shen-kun approached the eldest mermaid waitress and whispered urgently in her ear. At once, she snapped back to attention and directed the other mermaids to refill the captain's table. Well aware from Shen-kun's presence that these guests were no ordinary patrons, she dared not delay. Moments later, another bottle of the house specialty was placed before Charles. He twisted off the cork and downed it in a single gulp. His eyes brightened the instant the wine hit his palate. "Exceptional vintage," he declared, slapping the table for emphasis. "Keep them coming." With that, Captain Charles leaned back and beckoned. "Fill 'em up." Chapter 7. The Tavern Brawl. "General Shen Kun, care to join me for a drink?" Charles called, flashing a grin as he tugged the grizzled commander toward an empty table. Shen Kun's lips curved into a wry smile. He gritted his teeth, seized his goblet, and downed it in one smooth motion. "Ha! Not bad for a greenhorn," he boomed, slapping the table. Charles laughed and raised his own cup. "Well done, old man. This porter's something else." He drained his mug in turn, then let out a hearty guffaw. Emboldened, Shen Kun wiped his lips and laughed even louder. Soon the two were locked in a friendly drinking contest. Bottle after bottle vanished. Encouraged by their generals, the rest of Charles's crew and even the Murloc guards joined in. The once quiet tavern erupted with thundering toasts, boisterous laughter, and clinking mugs. Word of the ruckus spread fast. Outside, curious mermaids pressed their faces to the windows, while a cluster of Murlocs lingered by the door, croaking in excitement. Inside, the air swirled with the scent of ale and brine. Music and shouts mingled in a raucous chorus. Time blurred. Sometime after dawn, Charles came to on a hard bench, the dim morning light slanting through cracks in the boards. A faint fishy odor hung in the air. He winced as a heavy boot dug into his side. He sat up with a start, yanking the offending foot away. "Ow! What in?" Charles blinked at the circle of half-asleep sailors and Murloc sentries staring back at him, their eyes wide with surprise. He rubbed his ribs, swallowed hard, and realized with a groan that he'd never look at Porter the same way again. General Shen Kun was the first to stir. With a groan of pain, Charles also woke, blinking against a sharp ache in his head and a throb in his foot. "It hurts," Charles mumbled, trying to sit up. Shen Kun, rubbing the bridge of his nose, hauled himself to his feet. He wasn't sure whether the worst pain came from his pounding skull or the bruised foot that protested every step. Around them lay the remains of a shattered hall, splintered wooden beams, toppled columns, and pools of dust kicked up in the melee. As the memory of last night's drinking binge with Charles came back to him, Shen Kun couldn't help but let out a wry chuckle. "So," he said, looking over at Charles, "Yai, I've recovered from our little party without holding a grudge, I hope?" Charles raised an eyebrow, feigning indignation. From where he sat, neatly perched on a bench beside a surprisingly intact table, he shot Shen Kun a sideways glance. "Grudge? Hardly. It's been ages since I've been this enthusiastic with my cups." Shen Kun shook his head and cracked a grin. In his younger days on Murloc Street, whenever his purse ran fat, he and his friends would celebrate just like this. But ever since he'd risen to the rank of general, stationed to guard Murloc Island, such carefree revelries had become all but extinct. He rubbed his stiff ankle, then beckoned Charles to stand. "Ha! Now that you're finally upright, come over here. I've got plenty to say." Charles pushed himself to his feet, brushing dust from his trousers, and followed Shen Kun toward the table. Together, they settled down amid the wreckage, two old comrades ready to swap stories long into the morning light. By now, the sun over Fishman Island had dimmed to a soft, muted glow, casting the deck in dusky half-light. All around them, the crew lay sprawled out like sleeping pigs, snoring so deeply they wouldn't wake for hours. When Charles spoke, Shen Kun stared at him in open surprise. He'd never imagined that the man the world called the blood-sword hero could be so easygoing, so unpretentious. Shen Kun's wide-eyed look only made Charles smile. After all, though Shen Kun was more than a year older, right now he looked every bit the awestruck child. Chapter 55. Surveillance. Charles looked every bit a 20-year-old youth, but in truth, his 2 lifetimes combined made him nearly as old as Shen Kun. He grinned up at the towering pirate captain. "Surprised? You didn't expect a notorious cutthroat like me to just drop by and chat, did you?" Shen Kun laughed heartily, his voice echoing off the tavern walls. "Ha! I never thought I'd see the day you'd come calling on me." Without another word, Charles lifted a goblet of wine and clinked it against Shen Kun's. The captain downed his drink in one gulp, and Charles followed suit. They poured another round and kept drinking until the eastern sky grew pale with dawn. Around them, the tavern's other patrons began to stir, blinking the sleep from their eyes as they noticed Charles sitting alone atop the bar. Paul, Charles's loyal quartermaster, slipped forward, concern etched on his face. "Boss, should we be making tracks?" he asked quietly, picking up on the tension in Charles's shoulders. Charles set his empty cup on the counter and nodded. "Once everyone's awake, we're heading back to the ship." Paul's lips pressed into a thin line of disappointment, but he bowed his head and turned to rouse the crew. Charles watched him go, the weight of what lay ahead settling over him like the morning mist. Charles watched Paul for a moment, brow furrowed. "You really want to spend 2 more days on Fishman Island?" He shook his head. "Everything here is so different from the surface world, and with all those beautiful mermaids roaming around, it's hard to leave." Paul shrugged, unease flickering across his face. Charles sighed. "Fine, stay if you want. Enjoy yourself." Immediately, Paul held up both hands. No, my goal isn't to lounge in paradise. I'm here to push my swordsmanship, not chase comfort." He gave Charles a wry smile, but it didn't change Charles's mood. He glanced back toward the harbor. "By the way, what happened to that blue merman commander Shen Kun? I haven't seen him all morning." Paul stood and scanned the empty docks. "Shen Kun? He went back to the island hours ago. Why did you want to see him?" Charles frowned, recalling their lively conversation over drinks just the night before. Shen Kun had even insisted on paying. He hadn't met anyone so entertaining in ages. "He left already?" "Seems so," Paul said, offering a shrug. "He was watching us carefully yesterday, but after a night of company and our excuse for seafood, he decided he had other business. I didn't push him." Charles studied the unsteady crew gathered on deck, preparing to cast off. In 2 days they'd set sail, leaving this vibrant undersea realm behind. A twinge of regret caught him by surprise. "All right," he said finally, forcing a grin. "But next time we dock here, I'm buying the first round." Paul chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Deal. Now come on, there's work to be done before we push off." Together they turned back to the ship, minds already racing with the adventures that lay ahead. Captain Paul's voice rang out across the deck. "All right, everyone up. We set sail today. Give me some cheers." Groggy from the night's festivities, the 20-odd crew members blinked themselves awake and turned toward Charles. Seeing them fully sober, he drained the last drop of wine from his bottle. "Let's move. Everybody aboard." Charles strode toward the tunnel entrance carved beneath Fishman Island. Along the way, the crew reapplied a fresh coating of coral bubble film, a prized product of Murloc Island, to the hull. With the film in place, their ship slipped beneath the waves into the underwater passage that tunneled under the Red Earth continent. They were bound for the first half of the sea route that, 20 years hence, would be known in the New World as the Grand Line, though that name did not yet exist. They sailed over Fishman Island and dove into the submerged channel, the hull gliding silently through dark waters. "Ready to surface," the navigator called. At his signal, the crew released ballast, and the ship shot upward at her twice its normal ascent speed. Charles pressed his hands against the rail, watching pale beams of sunlight swirl through the water. Then, with a deafening crack, the vessel burst free of the sea. Chunks of coral bubble coating rained back into the waves as they burst into the open air. Before them lay endless blue. Charles took a steadying breath. Their true adventure was about to begin. Charles stood at the bow, staring out at the shimmering sea. On the horizon lay the archipelago of Chambord, its islands cloaked in dense alkamin mangroves. Yet he had no intention of landing here. His sole purpose was to recover the 7-star sword, and Chambord was far too dangerous. It lay uncomfortably close to Marin Fando's naval headquarters and was regularly patrolled by Tianlong forces. If they spotted him, Charles knew he couldn't count on surviving even a single sword strike. He drew the Asuka Island chart that Xia Qi had entrusted to him and tossed it to the navigator. "Set course for Asuka Island," he said softly but firmly, cutting off the crew's whispered hopes of exploring Chambord. Though they'd longed to venture ashore, they dared not question their captain's orders. With a gentle turn of the helm, the ship pivoted away from the mangrove isles and pressed onward into open waters. Only after Charles's vessel had vanished from view did a shadowy naval warship slip into pursuit under the cover of darkness. As soon as Charles left Beehive Island, the Navy headquarters assigned him to Person of Interest status. His every move was tracked, first on Chica Island, and then, when word reached them that he'd sailed on to Fishman Island, the admirals grew alarmed. They feared Charles might be acting on orders from Locke to strike the island, whose strategic position is every bit as vital as that of the Florian Triangle. Fishman Island sits directly beneath the New World's sole entry route. If hostile forces seized it, they could funnel pirates straight into the Grand Line's latter half. Even the world government refused the Rock's pirates any foothold there. The moment Charles set foot on Fishman Island, the Navy convened an urgent high-level meeting. Plans were drawn up to dispatch Vice Admiral Zephyr with a task force to intercept him. Yet before that fleet could depart, intelligence from an undercover agent on Fishman Island changed everything. Charles had spent only one evening ashore, sharing drinks with Admiral Shen Kun of Fishman Island's defense forces, and by dawn, he was gone again. Stunned, the admiral scrambled to verify the spy's report. Had Charles truly been a guest of Shen Kun? If so, whose designs was he really serving? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud over Marine headquarters, forcing them to wonder whether they'd misjudged a young man whose past was as mysterious as it was potentially dangerous. Is there any hidden agenda behind Charles's sudden appearance in the first half of the Grand Line? Dr. Vegapunk, known in official circles as Cyborg Kong, spread out the latest intelligence reports before the assembled officers. For a long minute, they scanned through data from the Warlords Network and the Crane faction, but found nothing substantive. Admiral Sora, Vice Admiral Sengoku prompted, turning to the former Rock's pirate. You still have contacts among the Rock's remnant fleets. Didn't they give you any leads? Admiral Sora shook her head. I'm afraid not. The Rock's survivors yielded no concrete information. So far, the only thread is a possible link between Charles's voyage into the Grand Line and an undercover world government agent named Xia Qi. Beyond that, neither our Navy informants nor agents embedded within the government have turned up anything, and we've already lost several operatives chasing rumors. Cyborg Kong pressed his fingers together, anxiety flickering in his eyes. With crises mounting on every front, this dead end was especially frustrating. Were it not for the occasional data trickle from the Warlords and Crane faction, he might have abandoned the inquiry altogether. Lieutenant Admiral Crane scanned the same files. If all our assets keep drying up, we have no choice but direct surveillance, he said. Prepare a covert vessel. Let's shadow Charles and see what he's really up to. Admiral Steel Gu Kong listened intently as Crane finished his briefing. The older officer's eyes narrowed, but after a moment's thought, he gave a curt nod. Very well. Dispatch a surveillance vessel to shadow him at a distance. I want every move of Charles's tracked, no exceptions. Within minutes, the order flashed to the Chambord Islands Naval Station. Major General Aureus, an officer known for his precision and calm under pressure, assumed direct command of the operation. He and a hand-picked crew boarded the stealth frigate Cyborg Sora at first light, engines humming as the ship slipped quietly out of the harbor. Hours later, high in the crow's nest, the lookout's cry rang out over the Sora's deck. Your Excellency, Major General, we've picked up a heat signature matching the pirate Charles's vessel. He's on the move. At those words, General Aureus sprang into action, rallying his officers. The game was afoot. Chapter 56. Water Capital. Keep your distance and follow them, the Major General ordered, adjusting the collar of his coat of justice. The warship, disguised as a humble merchant vessel, fell into formation and trailed Charles's ship across the rippling blue sea. They'd been at sea for 7 days now, sweeping around the dreaded Devil Island before setting their course straight for the water capital. The salty air was tinged with quiet tension. Captain, that ship behind us. It's still on our tail, Isaac reported from the stern, his voice low. Charles glanced over his shoulder. That'll be the Navy's surveillance vessel. They're just keeping an eye on us. Nothing to worry about. He offered a reassuring nod. Isaac leapt up to the crow's nest, taking in the horizon with a practiced calm. While Paul was prone to panic, Isaac remained composed and spoke little. His mind stayed fixed on sword practice, much to Charles's satisfaction. Moments later, Paul hurried up, his brow furrowed. Captain, the water capital is just ahead. Should we make landfall there before we head on to Aska Island? Charles climbed onto the bowsprit and looked out at the vast expanse of sea. Below him, the 20-odd crew members stood at their stations, their movements slow with fatigue from days of constant watch. The gentle rocking of the ship and the endless vista made them appear almost listless. He took a steadying breath, drawing in the sea breeze. Yes, we'll dock at the water capital. Everyone, prepare to make port. Get some rest, resupply, and then we set off for Aska Island. Dismissed. A ripple of relief ran through the crew as they sprung into action. Charles remained at the bow a moment longer, eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the water capital's spired skyline, already planning their next move. Charles paused, considering his next words carefully. The water capital lay just beyond Judicial Island, one of the world government's 3 main strongholds. Few dared to act recklessly here. Only Charles knew that, 30 or 40 years down the road, Judicial Island would be all but obsolete, devoid of any true power. But today's reality might be very different. Better safe than sorry. All right, he said to Paul, we'll give everyone the day off. But make one thing clear, no trouble. Paul's face lit up with relief. He dashed back to the rest of the crew and delivered the good news. Long live the boss, came the roar of 20 voices in unison. Charles felt their elation wash over him and returned their cheers with a warm smile. He climbed up onto the ship's bow, closed his eyes, and let the sunlight play across his face. Time drifted by until he slipped into a peaceful nap. A burst of excitement roused him. Boss, boss, we're here! Paul was nearly dancing as he shook Charles awake. Blinking against the glare of the sunlit harbor, Charles sat up. Before him sprawled the water capital, a city rising in graceful tiers around a colossal fountain-like structure, its waters cascading down marble steps. In anime, it might look impressive enough, but seeing it live, towering, glittering, alive, was something else entirely. His heart pounded with anticipation. This was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Charles leaned over the rail as his boat drifted into the vast harbor of the Seven Waters capital. The winding canals, the ornate stone buildings rising on either bank, everything felt uncannily familiar. Could this be the Venice I once knew in another life? Before he could dwell on the thought, the vessel slipped beneath a soaring arch bridge and glided into the bustling port. He was the first to step onto the quay, and the instant his boot hit the planks, a dozen eager voices clamored around him. Sir, would you care for a guide? 1,000 pelle a day, best rates in the city. Sir, looking for a custom ship? Martin Shipyard builds anything under 200 meters. Sir, need a carriage? Fine blue brew, half the usual price. Charles chuckled at the friendly onslaught. He raised a hand in greeting. Thank you all. Enjoy evening. Meet me back here at dawn, and we'll talk business. A roar went up. Long live the boss. 20 burly sailors hustled forward, tossed their pouches of coins onto the deck, and hurried off into the city. Charles watched them disappear down the quay, then turned to a waiting attendant. I'll take the brew, he said, pointing to a light, sky-blue carriage tethered nearby. Settling onto its cushioned bench, he urged the horses on, eager to explore every canal and boulevard of this storied capital. They'd only gone a few blocks when a voice rang out from the dock. Moses, Moses, a tall man called, striding toward them with crisp authority. Major General Wells at your service. Charles stiffened in recognition. His first encounter on shore was about to begin, and he had a feeling this city held many more surprises in store. Charles and his pirate crew slipped into the glittering harbor of Seven Waters capital just before dawn. A thin mist curled around their sleek ships as they glided past the city's ancient sea walls. Charles, formerly known as Charlotte to those who mistook his name, stood at the prow, his dark eyes scanning the bustling docks. His ragtag band of pirates moved with practiced coordination, unloading crates and stocking supplies while keeping a wary eye on the shoreline. Unbeknownst to Charles, Rear Admiral Wells had donned civilian clothes and taken up a discreet position on the quay. He leaned against a wooden post, arms folded, his steely gaze fixed on Charles and his men. Through a concealed earpiece, Wells relayed every detail back to Navy headquarters, where Admiral Kong was caught off guard by the news. After weeks spent grappling with recruitment drives and red tape, Kong paused for a heartbeat before barking his orders into the microphone. Maintain visual contact, but do not engage. Understood? Yes, sir, replied Wells, his voice low but steady. He clicked off the comms unit, shook himself free of the adrenaline, and turned to the 30 undercover Marines arrayed behind him. Spread out, he ordered. Track each pirate separately. If you uncover anything actionable, fire a signal flare. Above all, stay safe and keep your distance. The Marines melted into the early morning crowd, their watchful eyes fixed on Charles as the pirate captain continued his covert operation in the heart of the capital. Your Excellency, Major General. With that crisp shout and a quick salute, the soldiers fanned out across the docks, intent on scouring Charles's ship for any sign of pirates. Meanwhile, Wells moved at a leisurely pace. He'd rented a small skiff from a merchant and kept it a discreet distance behind Charles's boat, eyes glued to the younger man's back. Charles sensed the shadow trailing him. Though it would have been no trouble to dispatch Wells, he knew better than to draw attention. Once you kill one pursuer, a dozen stronger ones will come bearing down. He'd been drifting through the sprawling capital of the Seven Seas for days now, without once bothering to obscure his identity. Curiously, no one here seemed to recognize him as the infamous pirate with the massive bounty. Perhaps they suffered from the notorious face blindness common in these waters. Better still, nobody had dared interfere. Even Wells, whose mission was to apprehend him, hadn't attempted a seizure. Were they waiting for reinforcements? Charles doubted it. Wells had been on his trail for 7 full days. If a larger force were poised to strike, they would have intercepted him long before he made it to the heart of the capital, certainly not waited for him to arrive at its busiest port. With that certainty, Charles leaned back on his battered wooden bench, tucked one boot over the other, and allowed himself a small, confident smile. The game was still very much afoot, and he was still in control. Charles had suspected as much. It was nothing more than surveillance, so he let the tailing boat fade into the distance. He continued to glide through the winding canals of the Seven Rivers capital aboard his little skiff, Blue. Whenever he spotted something eye-catching, he'd pause to investigate. Whenever he smelled something delicious, he'd fork over coin without a second thought. Unbeknownst to him, his carefree splurges had already painted a target on his back. Alone on Blue, hurling gold coins at street vendors like confetti, Charles had drawn the attention of some unsavory characters. He'd felt the malicious gleam in their eyes, but paid them no mind. After polishing off the last of his river fish skewers, he moored Blue at a quiet dock and headed into a narrow, deserted alley, pretending he needed to relieve himself. He even fumbled at his belt buckle to make the ruse convincing. No sooner had he unfastened the buckle than a soft chorus of jingling steel answered him. 7 or 8 men closed in, their swords whispering from their sheaths. Charles pressed himself against the cool brick wall, his pulse hammering in his ears. "You? Who are you?" he stammered, panic tightening his throat. One of the men stepped forward, folding his arms. A faint scar curved across his cheek as he gave Charles a cold smile. "We serve the Raphael family," he said. "Hand over your purse, boy, and no one gets hurt. If you want to live, hand over the Bailey." The leader, a heavy-set man with a cruel grin, pressed the flat of his knife against Charles's chest. His eyes glittered, as if Charles were nothing more than game cornered in the dark. "Bailey, boy, we know you're carrying it." Charles's heart raced. The Bailey, an illicit ledger that named every debtor in the city, was more dangerous in the wrong hands than any weapon. Instinctively, he clenched his hand over the worn leather pouch strapped to his belt. "I don't have it," he stammered, stepping back. The gang's attention snapped to his waist. Eager laughter broke out among them. "No Bailey? Then you'd better explain yourself," snarled the leader. "Give us that pouch, or you won't walk away tonight." Chapter 57. Scumvic, the gang's wiry knife man, lunged at Charles, blade aimed for his pocket. The moment Charles saw him step forward, all trace of panic vanished. A confident smile spread across his face as he seized the knife at the hilt and ripped it from Vic's grip. "Ow!" Vic howled, clutching his hand. Charles hadn't even broken a sweat. With a single effortless twist, he snapped Vic's wrist like a twig. "Try mugging me, will you? Your bad luck just got worse," he taunted. He glanced at the others. They'd come in 8, now only 7 remained, since one was pinned under Charles's boot. "Boss! Help me!" Vic screamed, writhing beneath the pressure. Charles pressed down harder, trapping Vic's chest in a vice of iron and leather. "Let him go, now," Charles said softly, every word a warning. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man nicknamed Fatty, froze for a heartbeat. He'd expected an easy score, but this scrawny kid was turning the tables single-handedly. Still, 7 against 1 was overwhelming odds, and Fatty loved those odds. He barked, "Men, get him! Kill him!" Charles's smirk darkened. He drew back the blade, his captive's broken wrist a grim reminder of just how badly they'd misjudged him. As the gang closed in, Charles braced himself, ready to prove that they'd picked the wrong boy to rob. "Kill him!" The fat man's command cut through the tense air. His henchmen surged forward, knives glinting in their hands. Charles stood his ground, unblinking and strangely serene, as the attackers closed in. "Boy, you're full of nerve," snarled the leader. With a harsh laugh, he plunged his long knife toward Charles's abdomen. But instead of slicing through flesh, the blade struck an impenetrable barrier. Steel clanged against steel. The sound rang out like a hammer on an anvil. Staggering back, the fat man's eyes widened in shock as he stared at the knife's tip, buried against a shifting black sheen that covered Charles's stomach. Charles didn't say a word. He simply met the man's gaze with that same calm smile. You're a devil fruit user," the fat man finally gasped, voice trembling. Only a devil fruit power could explain why his blade had been stopped cold. On the first stretch of the Grand Line, so few sailors truly understand the power of armament Haki, and the burly thug before Charles was clearly no exception. Charles remained silent, a faint, knowing smile playing at his lips as he met the man's glare. "You think you can scare me just because you ate a devil fruit?" The fat man barked, his panic erupting into rage. "Men, kill him!" With that, he swung his oversized blade in a vicious arc. 6 henchmen sprang forward, axes and long knives gleaming as they joined the assault. Charles didn't flinch. Instead, he simply smiled, and in the next heartbeat, a dark metallic sheen crept over his skin. His entire body turned a deep purple black as his armament Haki flared to life. Clang, clang, clatter! Steel met steel. Blades struck Charles again and again, sending sparks flying, but each blow rang hollow against the invisible armor he'd forged around himself. The fat man's heavy breaths grew ragged. He staggered back, his knife now nicked and dulled by dozens of fruitless strikes. One by one, his companions slowed, blades wavering in midair, shock replacing their murderous intent. At last, Charles lowered his arms. The dark sheen faded, leaving not a single scratch on his clothing or flesh. The fat man stared at him, eyes wide and uncomprehending. How is this possible?" the thug panted. Charles's smile deepened. "Armament Haki. You couldn't harm a man who wields it." With that, the fat man's shoulders sagged. He dropped his blade with a heavy thud, and his crew followed suit. In the stunned silence that followed, it was clear Charles had won the encounter without drawing a drop of blood. Charles watched as the 7 men froze the instant their leader halted. Shotguns still leveled at him. They stared in disbelief. After all, they just emptied their barrels into him. Yet here he stood, calm and unscathed. A cold smile curved his lips. "Since you've all stopped," he said softly, "now it's my turn." He flexed his fingers once. A sickening crack echoed through the courtyard. At his feet, the fat man, known among the others as Boss Bao, collapsed, his sternum caved in, ribs shattered. Blood spurted from his mouth as his eyes widened in horror. Then his head lolled to the side, and he died. "Oh, what a pity," Charles murmured, stepping forward. "But now it's your turn to entertain me." He spread his arms wide, the moonlight glinting off the 6 rifles they still clutched. Charles saw the fear in their eyes, the same panic that had gripped them when they realized their boss was gone. Underneath that terror lay something darker, hatred masked by false bravado. Charles's gaze swept over them. He knew who they were. Child traffickers, slavers, heartless men who tore families apart without a second thought. Their crimes were unspeakable, and the man he'd just killed, Boss Bao, had been more than their enforcer. He was their secret kingpin, a detail Charles hadn't suspected until now. "Do you really think you're untouchable?" Charles's voice dropped to a whisper that carried all the weight of his fury. He advanced a step. The remaining 6 shuffled back, their barrels wavering. He recalled their victims, the terrified children sold at auction, the families left in ruins. Each name, Each plea for mercy fueled the fire in his chest. Tonight, the reckoning had come. "Line up," he commanded, one by one. As they obeyed, Charles's resolve hardened. No mercy for these monsters, not after what they'd done. Not tonight. It turned out the mayor of the capital of Seven Waters had been backing these thugs all along. Charles wasn't their judge, and he couldn't have cared less about their mock trial, but cross him, and you were courting death. "Enough," he barked. "Scatter!" Finally, panic set in. The gangsters turned on their heels and sprinted for the door. Their boss only managed a panicked squeak as Charles watched them flee. Charles flexed his foot, gathering a faint azure glow around his toes. In an instant, 6 razor-sharp streaks of light sliced through the air, severing the legs of the fleeing men mid-stride. With agonized screams, they collapsed, bleeding and broken. Heathed in silent authority, Charles observed them writhing. Losing a limb wasn't an instant finish, but the pain that followed was a torment worse than death. In the midst of the chaos, the hefty man at the back froze stone still. His eyes widened at the sight of his comrades cut down before him. Desperation overtook him. He spun on his heel, threw himself to his knees before Charles, and began frantic kowtows. "Mercy, please," he gasped, voice trembling. I don't dare oppose you any longer. It wasn't my choice. That villain forced me into this. Spare me, and I'll hand over every treasure I possess. Please, have mercy." The rotund man's massive frame shook as he continued bowing, begging Charles not to add him to the tally of the maimed. Charles collapsed to one knee, his palms pressing into the gleaming floor. He drew in a ragged breath, then forced himself upright, each deliberate step echoing sharply until he stood directly before the fat man. The man looked up, panic flashing in his eyes. He reflexively bowed his head and tapped a glove against the floor in a crude show of deference. "Excuse me," he stammered. With that pathetic bottle of Bailey's you couldn't have spent more than 40 yuan on, you actually think you can muscle your way past me? You've got a lot of nerve." Charles crouched, staring up at him. "What? How do you know about the Baileys?" The fat man's face went pale. He let out a trembling laugh. "Ha!" But before he could finish, Charles lifted his foot and drove it into the man's cheek with brutal force. There was a sickening crack as blood and shattered teeth spattered across the floor. The fat man let out a strangled scream, curling into himself, his hand reaching out for mercy. Charles delivered a merciless kick that snapped the man's wrist, then stepped back. "Don't touch me," Charles hissed. "It's filthy." He bent to retrieve the long knife lying where it had fallen. The blade winked in the overhead light as he straightened, his eyes cold and unflinching. "What?" The fat man's scream cut off abruptly as Charles moved with deadly precision, severing his arms and legs and propping them against the alley wall like grotesque trophies. "I won't kill you," Charles said, his voice cold and steady. "But I will let you live in fear." He let the long blade clatter to the ground, then turned and strode out of the narrow passage. Behind him lay 7 lifeless bodies and the anguished cries of the lone survivor echoing off the brick walls. Snap, snap, snap! The sound of bones breaking trailed after him as the fallen thug collapsed. No sooner had Charles disappeared into the street than applause broke out from the shadows. "That's our notorious pirate with a 5 billion berry bounty, merciless and precise." Chapter 58, The Lonely Red. A sudden flare of color cut through the twilight haze on the pier. A young man strode forward, clad in a purple tunic, blood-red breeches, and a sweeping scarlet cloak that billowed behind him. Perched atop his head were striking red eyebrows, and in his hand he carried an ornate crimson umbrella. At his appearance, the dockworkers and pirates broke into spontaneous applause. "Well," the stranger called out, voice smooth and confident. Charles froze, his pulse pounding. He spun to face the newcomer, narrowing his eyes in cautious surprise. Recognition slammed into him. This was Patrick Redfield, the Red Earl, already whispered about as the sea's next great power, destined to stand alongside legends like Gol D Roger, the Golden Lion, and Whitebeard. And yet here he was, arriving long before he was supposed to have even entered the New World. The Red Earl's lips curved into a faint, amused smile. "You know me, do you?" he asked, tilting his head. Charles swallowed hard but held his ground. Never had he expected to meet Patrick Redfield in person, least of all on this very dock. But fate, it seemed, had a way of rewriting even the boldest legends. Since childhood in his past life, Patrick Redfield had been fascinated by the legendary Rumba pirates he'd read about on an old forum. The moment he regained his memories, he vowed to become a pirate himself. He knew, however, that the Rumba pirates had never set foot in the New World. They were wiped out in the Sabaody archipelago by a deadly virus. Only Brook had cheated death, thanks to the powers of the Yomi no Mi, yet he remained trapped in those mist-shrouded waters. No one else dared sail into that fog. Now Patrick stood on the deck of his ship, the Scarlet Breeze, peering out at the calm sea. He didn't expect to meet someone like this so early in the Grand Line. "Mr. Charles?" a voice called. Charles Wilde looked up from the rail, meeting the newcomer's steady gaze. He took in the man's confident posture, the faint scar tracing his jaw. There was something familiar about him. "I must admit," Charles said, masking his surprise with a calm nod, "I didn't expect to encounter someone of your caliber this far into the Grand Line." A faint smile curved the stranger's lips. "The pleasure's mine. I'm Patrick Redfield, known on the seas as the Red Earl." He extended a hand. "And you are?" "Charles Wilde," he replied, clasping the offered hand firmly. "At your service." Patrick let his smile widen. "There's a storm brewing up ahead. If you're looking for adventure and rewards, you're welcome to join us." Charles glanced up at the gathering clouds, then back at Patrick's eager face. The promise of danger and treasure gleamed in his eyes. "All right," Charles said, stepping forward. "Let's see what the Grand Line has in store." "The current bounty on me is 100 Baileys," announced the Red Earl, drawing a parchment from his coat and unfolding it toward Charles. Charles froze. He'd read that Patrick Redfield, the infamous Red Earl, was a recluse who shunned all contact. Yet here he was, politely presenting his own bounty. What was going on? Seeing Charles's surprise, the Red Earl offered a gentle smile and tucked the list away. "Though I sail as a pirate, I don't slaughter innocents. So far, all my rewards have been for slaying sea creatures. They still don't know my true strength." Charles exhaled and nodded. "I understand, but if this isn't just a formal greeting, may I ask why you've come to find me?" He furrowed his brow, meeting the Red Earl's gaze. The pirate leader chuckled softly, his eyes alight with curiosity. Chapter 7. A Duel on the Uninhabited Shore. "I wish to test my strength against your excellency," the Red Earl announced, his voice calm but resolute. "I want to know exactly where I stand." Charles regarded him coolly. A challenge between equals was exactly what he'd been craving. "Very well," he said. "Choose an uninhabited island, and I'll meet you there." The Red Earl snapped open his umbrella and pointed toward the horizon. Charles followed the gesture, his sharp eyes picking out a stretch of sand nearly the size of 10 football fields. No docks, no settlements, just a lone beach waiting for 2 swordsmen. "That one?" Charles agreed with a nod. "Let's go." He strode to the marina, where his rented motorboat, Blue, lay bobbing in the gentle swell. With a single leap, he was aboard, fingers dancing over the throttle. The engine purred to life, and Blue glided away from the dock, slicing through the waves toward the deserted shore. As the coastline drew nearer, Charles's heart quickened with anticipation. This was more than a mere sparring match. It was an opportunity to prove his mettle. Whatever awaited him on that beach, he was ready. Ryder vaulted onto Blue's back, and together they made for the deserted stretch of beach. Unnoticed by them, the rear admiral assigned to keep an eye on Charles had slipped into pursuit. Charles and Ryder both spotted him tailing too closely. Ahead of them, Patrick Redfield's ship drew level. The Red Earl leaned over the rail and called out, "Your Excellency Charles, you've got company. Someone's shadowing us." Charles flashed a confident grin and waved a hand. "Relax, he's just a Navy observer. After all, a pirate of my reputation venturing into the first half of the Grand Line is bound to draw eyes. If Marine Headquarters can't see that, they must be blind." The Red Earl raised an eyebrow. Despite being watched by the Navy, Charles showed no sign of worry. "Aren't you at all concerned?" Chuckling, Charles shook his head. "Only 4 officers in the entire Navy can give me pause. Admiral Cyborg Sora, Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp, Fleet Admiral Sengoku, and Commander Zephyr. Everyone else at headquarters is just window dressing." Patrick Redfield gaped. Numbers meant nothing to warriors like them. Only raw strength counted. Seriously? Last month, the whole world was talking about how you and Zephyr shook the Navy to its core. They even warned of a direct clash between the Rocks pirates and Navy headquarters. And you're telling us you were the ones who lost? Ryder shot Charles a mischievous grin. Charles bristled, cheeks flushing. That's nonsense. It was a stalemate. Zephyr and I battled for 3 straight days and nights until we both finally collapsed. The Navy twisted the story and leaked it through News King Morgan's just to save face. Ryder fought back a laugh. Charles's anger looked genuine enough, and Ryder knew when someone was telling the truth. He'd only met this so-called mind reader moments ago, but he suspected Charles really could influence what people believed. After all, Ryder himself carried an imposing aura that let him peer into thoughts without even touching a person, an ability far more powerful than mere mind reading. If Charles had been pulling strings behind the scenes, Ryder would have sensed it immediately. Because of his uncontrollable telepathy, he's constantly overwhelmed by everyone else's thoughts, and most of them are dark. That's why he prefers solitude, often sailing the open sea alone. But today, when he met Charles, he sensed nothing, no thoughts, no hidden emotions. The absence of any mental trace only deepened his fascination with Charles. Chapter 59. Hedging. General Steelbone? This is Major General Wells. I've picked up something strange. The infamous pirate Charles has rendezvoused with another pirate, Red Earl Patrick Redfield, the same man who dominated the early stages of the Grand Voyage. Now they're both heading for an uninhabited island. We don't know what they're plotting. Cyborg Sora, who'd been poring over reports alongside Sengoku and Crane, snapped his head up at the news crackling through the comm. He caught Lieutenant General He's eye. He was listening in too. The Red Earl? Sora echoed with a frown. Crane flushed with recognition. He thumbed through his files and produced the wanted poster for Patrick Redfield. Beneath the scarlet-trimmed portrait was the staggering bounty, 1,000 Baileys. So that's him, Crane said quietly. What could Charles hope to gain from this meeting? Sengoku and Crane exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Sengoku spoke into the comlink. Major General Wells, continue your surveillance, but for your own safety, stay well clear of that island. Understood, Sora replied, voice firm. We'll keep a close watch on them and report any new developments immediately. Wells, seated aboard the Blue, couldn't help but give a wry chuckle into his transmitter. General Sora, I think they've realized they're bugged, but oddly enough, those 2 pirates haven't made a move. His words crackled over the covert bug in Sora's comm system. The cyborg general's eyes narrowed. They've discovered it? When did this happen? Just now, Wells replied. That purple-cloaked Red Earl caught on, but he doesn't seem inclined to seize control of me. Understood, General Sora said after a pause. Maintain a safe distance and keep them under observation. If anything goes south, you fall back immediately and stay in constant contact. Roger that. As soon as the Blue ran aground on the deserted island, Charles and the Red Earl vaulted ashore together. Charles paused at the water's edge, sweeping the empty beach with a practiced gaze to make sure no one else was around. The Red Earl studied him with a teasing glint in his eye. Tell me, big pirate with a 5 billion Bailey bounty, don't you care whether this place is populated? Charles scratched the back of his head, clearly puzzled. Haha, sorry, I'm not quite following you. Charles snapped back at the Red Earl. I never kill civilians on purpose. That would violate every moral instinct I have. The Red Earl cocked an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, and what, pray tell, is this moral code you cling to? Charles met his gaze steadily. My rule is simple. If someone doesn't harm me, I won't harm them. But if they do, I'll repay them 100-fold. That's my code. A flicker of surprise crossed the Red Earl's face. He found himself oddly impressed. His own principles weren't so different, though he tended to be less discriminating when it came to bystanders. He managed a grin. Is that so? Admirable indeed. He tipped his umbrella, the metal tip gleaming in the afternoon light. But enough talk. It's time we see whose code holds stronger. With a boisterous laugh, the Red Earl brought the umbrella down in a sweeping arc, his signal to begin the duel. Charles tensed, ready to defend himself and uphold his uncompromising sense of justice, no matter what it took. Then let's fight! Charles drew his longsword, and a shocking aura burst from the ground like a tidal wave. Pure, unrelenting overlord power radiated from him, sucking in the very air. The Red Earl's eyes widened in admiration. Incredible, but I won't be outdone. He set his ornate umbrella aside and, meeting Charles's gaze, unleashed his own domineering presence. The opposing forces clashed in midair, each struggling to overpower the other. Charles allowed himself a small, respectful nod. Well fought. Even the admiral patrolling the sea was stunned by the display. Major General Wells, monitoring the comms, blurted out, "Good heavens, they're auras." On the other end, Cyborg Sora's voice crackled through. "Well, what's happening? What auras?" Wells steadied himself and replied, "General Sora, Pirate Charles and the Red Earl have engaged on that deserted island ahead. Both are channeling Overlord energy. It's tearing the sky apart." The moment Rear Admiral Wells finished speaking, the officers in Navy headquarters sat up straighter, disbelief written across their faces. A pirate with a 100 million Bailey bounty, who dared to split the sky with his Haki. How had their intelligence fallen so far behind? "Major General Wells," Cyborg Sora asked, voice trembling, "are you certain of what you just reported?" Wells didn't answer right away. Instead, he peered through the panoramic viewport at the storm-torn sky. A jagged fissure ran across the clouds, and sheets of seawater whipped themselves into frenzied waves as if reacting to some unseen force. After a long moment, he simply nodded. That's exactly what our surveillance bug is transmitting." Cyborg Kong stared at the live feed monitor in shock. On it stood a lone figure, Charles, his silhouette framed by dark, rippling energy. Anyone capable of manifesting such an overwhelming king's aura had to be a master of Haki, someone far more dangerous than a low-tier pirate. "How?" Kong began, then shook his head. "We specifically instructed you to plant that video bug while monitoring him, Admiral, yet none of our intelligence reports hinted at this level of power." Sora swallowed hard. "We assumed a pirate with only 100 million Bailey bounty wouldn't possess advanced Haki. We were wrong." Wells' expression hardened. "Clearly, we underestimated him, but no more." He turned to face the room. "Alert every fleet in the vicinity. If Charles can rend the sky itself, we'll need our full strength and better information before we make our move." A tense silence fell, punctuated only by the roar of the sea on the monitor. The man called Charles, once dismissed as a minor pirate, had just declared himself a force the Navy could no longer ignore. And now, every ship in their fleet would sail into the storm to bring him down. Major General Wells slipped to one side, drew a compact video transceiver from his coat, flipped it on, and trained it on the battlefield. Cyborg Kong let out a roar. "Don't just listen to reports, see it for yourselves," he thundered. At his command, Steelbone Kong, Sengoku, and Crane exchanged eager glances. "If you can't trust hearsay, let your eyes decide." Wells didn't hesitate. He flipped open the tiny lens, and the screen immediately came to life. Everyone in the command office held their breath as the image resolved. Wells had chosen his angle perfectly. Both Charles and the Red Earl were in view, framed by the roiling sky above them. On the screen, Charles stood motionless, sword tip planted in the earth, cloak billowing in a sudden wind. 10 meters away, the Red Earl leaned casually against his ebony umbrella, gaze as steady as ever. Neither moved, yet their very presence crackled with power. Charles's aura glowed a deep, menacing crimson that clashed vividly with the Red Earl's pulsing purplish-red light. No words were spoken, only the silent promise of the duel to come. "I'd be happy to help polish the chapter. Could you please provide the full text you'd like rewritten? Right now, I only see the 2 lines below. Once I have the complete chapter, I can revise it into a coherent idiomatic English version with Charles as the male protagonist." Original snippet. "There's no winner. Where did the Red Earl come from?" Jean Guo was shocked when he saw the domineering and domineering confrontation between the two, because he is also the owner of the domineering and domineering look, and he knew that it was not that simple to make this scene. Please paste the rest of the chapter, and I'll get right to work on a smooth, polished rewrite. Chapter 60. Favorite Admiral Warring States had just finished her briefing when Crane, the Navy's chief of staff, slipped out of the conference room in uneasy silence. It was her responsibility to track every rising threat, and now there was word of a pirate who could stand toe-to-toe with Charles. The very notion weighed on her. A foe powerful enough to match Charles usually carried a bounty in the hundreds of millions. Yet this new adversary's reward was set at only 100 million Baileys, a thinly veiled insult to the Navy's honor. Crane's departure drew no protest from Steel Gukong. He understood all too well why she'd gone straight to digging for answers. If they were going to unmask the legendary Red Earl, they needed every scrap of information they could get, and fast. Steel Gukong motioned to Steelbone Kong and Sengoku. Though the single photograph before them was grainy and taken from a great distance, the three officers pored over it until they were certain. The face in the blur, the stance, everything pointed to one man. At last, they exchanged knowing glances. Far away on a windswept beach, the Red Earl surveyed the sea with cool amusement. After a long, silent standoff in which he'd measured his opponent's strength against his own, he allowed himself a thin smile. Yes, he thought, no one here yet knew what they were up against. With deliberate grace, he drove the metal spike of his umbrella into the sand and stepped forward, bare hands ready. The next battle was coming, and he could hardly wait. Charles understood the Red Earl's intention the moment he saw him drive his sword blade into the sand. With a swift gesture, Charles did the same, sheathing his own blade in the beach and advancing with empty hands. When they were still 5 paces apart, both men let out a roar, opening their arms and hurling themselves forward. Black armored energy swirled around their clenched fists. Bang! Their blows met in midair, sending a thundering shockwave through the beach. Sand exploded in every direction, yet neither combatant yielded an inch. They pressed forward instinctively, feeling out the other's strength. Then, as if struck by the same thought, they both broke into wide grins. Clenching their fists again, they laughed together, each delighted to have found a rival worthy of his skill. From that moment on, their punches came in rapid succession. Bang, 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 each strike faster than the last. Shadows of limbs blurred and wove together so quickly that it was impossible to tell one fist from the other. Charles's armament Haki flared in a deep crimson black, a stark contrast to the Red Earl's own purple-black aura. The two fighters faced off in the courtyard, the afternoon sun glinting off their clashing wills. In a heartbeat, they surged forward, fists meeting with a resounding crack. Blow after blow, neither yielded until Charles unleashed everything he had. His final strike drove the Red Earl back a pace, halting the duel as dust swirled around their feet. The Red Earl pressed a hand to his purple-black-coated fist and frowned in surprise. He had braced himself with armament Haki. Why did it still hurt so much? Charles, breathing evenly, took in the Earl's puzzled expression and smiled with a hint of triumph. That last move, I used an advanced Haki technique that damages the opponent from within. It's called Liu Ying, Shadow of the Willow. It's a specialized form developed in Wano country. Strong, isn't it? He spoke openly, as if sharing a fascinating trick rather than concealing a secret advantage. Charles wanted everyone to know about Liu Ying. It made the fight all the more memorable. The Red Earl flexed his injured arm, feeling the lingering ache. Then he gave a slow, appreciative nod. Truly formidable, Charles. Your master taught you well. Charles tucked his fist back into his coat, his crimson-black Haki dissipating. Around them, the gathered spectators exchanged awed whispers. The name Liu Ying would surely spread through the fleet, and the legend of Charles, who mastered it, would grow then larger. Charles let out a low whistle. If the enemy showed up here out of the blue, we'd never see it coming. Red-haired Shanks dropped his arms and grinned at Charles. You're absolutely right. Staying in the first half of the Grand Line all the time gets dull. We need to head into the New World for a while. Charles beamed. I'm glad you agree, Shanks. Once this battle's over, I'm planning to sail into the New World myself, to take on the strongest fighters there. Shanks chuckled, a hint of approval in his eyes. For a man as proud and reserved as the red-haired, one who rarely takes anyone's advice, this was high praise indeed. Ha-ha! In the New World, you'll find opponents like Edward Newgate, the man they call Whitebeard, the Golden Lion, Shiki, and Charlotte Linlin, one of the 4 emperors. If you can hold your own against them, you'll grow stronger than you ever imagined. Shanks's brow furrowed in genuine curiosity. They're that powerful, Charles nodded earnestly. Terrifyingly so. Charles stood tall, a confident spark in his eyes. Everyone wants to become a monster. I may not be able to beat them yet, but that's only temporary. I'm just 20 years old. Give me a few more years to grow, and I won't fear anyone." The Red Earl's lips curled into an amused smile. "And what about your captain?" At the mention of Captain Locks, Charles stiffened. He weighed his words carefully before replying in a low voice. "If you value your life, don't challenge Locks, at least not until you've reached your full strength. He's that powerful enough to make the world government think twice before declaring war." The Red Earl's expression sobered, and he gave a measured nod. Though the fire in his eyes still burned bright, he clearly understood the warning. Charles relaxed, pleased that his message had landed, and leaned forward as if sharing a secret. Of course, in the New World, it isn't only the Rock's pirates who wield tremendous power. There's another crew out there, one that commands respect and fear in equal measure. Although they don't quite measure up to the Rock's pirates, the Roger pirates still rank among the very best, Charles explained to the Red Earl. Captain Roger, First Mate Rayleigh, and Combatant Jabba are each renowned across the seas for their strength. The Roger pirates? The Red Earl arched an eyebrow. He clearly knew the name. He even grumbled about a vice admiral from headquarters who had them in his sights, but his expression carried a hint of disdain. Charles held the Red Earl's gaze and pressed on. "Don't underestimate them. None of the Roger pirates have devil fruits. They depend entirely on raw strength and swordsmanship. Roger and Rayleigh are both grand swordmasters of legendary skill, and Jabba, well, he's also a grand swordmaster. Only his weapon of choice is an axe, and his power is nothing short of overwhelming." Seeing Charles speak so confidently, the Red Earl gave a reluctant nod, though his cool look of skepticism didn't fade. Charles allowed himself a small, private smile. He'd said his piece. Whether the Red Earl believed him or not was another story. Charles's eagerness to discuss the Red Earl sprang from genuine admiration, and the Red Earl, in turn, found himself equally drawn to Charles, if only because, for the first time, he couldn't peer into the young man's mind. Their easy conversation offered the Earl a comfort he had never known before. "I've told you all I can about the New World," Charles said, stepping back with a grin. "Shall we move on to the next match?" With that, Charles rolled to one side, avoiding an unseen strike, then thrust his arm into the sand to extract his longsword, its blade still gleaming despite being half buried. He rose to his feet, blade in hand and eyes alight with determination, ready to face whatever challenge awaited him next.